Night settles slowly over the mountains of northern Mexico. The air cools, carrying the faint scent of earth and dust, and somewhere in the distance a dog barks once before falling silent again. In these hills, stories are not shouted. They are whispered. Names are spoken carefully, as if the land itself might be listening. Among those names, one traveled farther than any road, crossed more borders than any migrant, and lingered longer than most dared to admit. Joaquin Archibaldo Guzman Lara. To the world, he would become known as El Chapo. To many who lived under his shadow, he was simply the man you did not speak about at night. Long before headlines, before courtrooms and prison walls, his story existed as a quiet current running beneath daily life. In villages scattered across the Sierra Madre, his name drifted through conversations like smoke, curling around truth and myth until the two became difficult to separate. Some said he was everywhere. Others claimed he was already gone. What remained consistent was the feeling he inspired, a mixture of fear, respect, and disbelief that a single man could shape so much of the modern underworld while rarely being seen. This is not a story that begins with power. It does not open in luxury or violence or excess. It begins in obscurity, where survival itself is a daily calculation. The mountains of Sinaloa are beautiful in a harsh, unforgiving way. Steep slopes, narrow dirt paths, and isolated communities define the landscape. For generations, these hills produced little wealth beyond what could be coaxed from the soil. Corn, beans, and, quietly, crops that would never be sold openly in markets. In such places, the line between legality and necessity was never clearly drawn. As the world beyond these mountains modernized, demand grew for substances that could numb pain, heighten pleasure, or simply offer escape. That demand reached even the most remote regions, transforming forgotten valleys into strategic terrain. Trails once used by farmers and shepherds slowly became routes of commerce far more dangerous than livestock or grain. It was within this environment that the legend of El Chapo would slowly take shape, not as a sudden rise, but as a patient accumulation of influence. To understand why his name carried such weight, one must understand the silence surrounding it. El Chapo was not a man who sought attention in his early years. He did not announce himself with flamboyance or public displays of dominance. His power grew quietly, like roots spreading underground. While others chased visibility, he cultivated invisibility. This approach would define him, protect him, and eventually betray him. By the time international media began referring to him as one of the most powerful criminals in history, his reputation was already deeply embedded in the regions where he operated. Locals spoke of him as someone who understood the terrain, the people, and the unspoken rules that governed life on the margins. He was said to move through the mountains as easily as water, adapting to every obstacle, finding paths where none seemed to exist. Whether these stories were entirely true mattered less than the fact that people believed them. In the wider world, his name would later be paired with words like kingpin, mastermind, and most wanted. Yet those labels flatten a far more complex reality. El Chapo was not a solitary force. He was a product of systems, economic, political, and social, that had been in motion long before he entered them. Corruption, inequality, and demand created fertile ground. He merely learned how to navigate it better than most. As listeners drift into this story, it is important to slow down and resist the temptation to rush toward the moments of drama. The true weight of this tale lies not in sudden explosions of violence, but in the gradual normalization of extraordinary power. It lies in how an ordinary life, shaped by hardship and opportunity, can evolve into something that affects millions of lives across continents. There is something almost hypnotic about the contrast. On one side, a man born into poverty, navigating dirt roads and fragile childhood dreams. On the other, a figure whose decisions would influence global drug markets, destabilize regions, and prompt massive international manhunts. Between those 2 points stretches a long, quiet road, paved with choices that rarely announced themselves as historic in the moment they were made. At night, in cities far from Mexico, people would unknowingly cross paths with the consequences of those choices. Substances would change hands in dimly lit rooms, on crowded streets, in places where no one thought about the mountains of Sinaloa. And yet, invisibly, threads connected these moments back to a man who preferred shadows to spotlights. What made El Chapo particularly unsettling to authorities was not just his wealth or reach, but his ability to disappear. Time and again, he seemed to slip through cracks that should not have existed. Each escape, each evasion, reinforced the idea that he was less a person and more a presence, an embodiment of a system that could not easily be dismantled. This perception would fuel both fear and fascination, feeding a cycle of myth-making that grew stronger with every attempt to end his story. Yet beneath the legend was a human being, subject to the same emotions that govern all lives: fear, ambition, loyalty, and paranoia. These quieter elements often get lost in retellings focused on spectacle. But they are essential to understanding how such a figure could endure for so long. Power, when sustained over decades, demands constant vigilance. Trust becomes rare. Sleep becomes light. Every silence carries meaning. As this story unfolds, the listener is invited not to celebrate or condemn, but to observe. To watch how circumstances shape individuals, and how individuals, in turn, shape history. El Chapo's life offers no simple lessons, only complex reflections on how shadow economies thrive alongside official ones, and how attempts to eradicate them often strengthen the very myths they seek to destroy. In the quiet moments before sleep, when the world feels distant and softened, this tale becomes less about crime and more about inevitability. About how certain environments produce certain outcomes, again and again. El Chapo was not the first, and he would not be the last. But for a time, his shadow stretched longer than most, crossing borders, oceans, and imaginations. As the night deepens, the mountains remain. The villages remain. And the name, once whispered, now echoes through history. What follows is not a tale of sudden transformation, but a slow descent into the making of a figure who learned how to rule without being seen. And as with all such stories, it begins not with a crown, but with dust underfoot and silence in the air. The village of La Tuna rests quietly in the mountains of Badiraguato, far removed from the noise of cities and the attention of the outside world. Here, life moves according to the rhythms of daylight and season, not clocks or calendars. The soil is thin and stubborn, the kind that demands effort for every harvest. For families who lived here, survival was never guaranteed, only negotiated day by day. It was in this setting that Joaquin Guzman first opened his eyes, surrounded not by opportunity, but by endurance. Homes in La Tuna were simple, often built from whatever materials could be gathered or afforded. Tin roofs rattled in the wind, wooden walls carried the marks of weather and time. Inside, families shared tight spaces, meals stretched thin, and expectations kept modest. Children learned early that work was not optional. From a young age, Joaquin understood that hunger was not an abstract fear but a familiar presence. It sat quietly in the corners of daily life, shaping decisions before words were ever spoken. His father, like many men in the region, struggled under the weight of poverty and frustration. Accounts describe him as strict and often violent, a man hardened by limited choices and relentless hardship. Discipline in the household was enforced through fear rather than guidance, leaving little room for tenderness. For a child, such an environment offered few comforts. It did, however, teach lessons that would leave lasting impressions. Silence could be safer than honesty, obedience could prevent pain, and strength was something to be projected, not requested. His mother, by contrast, represented stability in a fragile world. She worked tirelessly to provide what little she could, tending to children and household responsibilities with quiet resilience. Her influence offered moments of warmth in an otherwise harsh upbringing. Yet even her efforts could not shield the family from the realities of their surroundings. Poverty was not a temporary condition here, it was a generational inheritance. Education in La Tuna was limited, and schooling often took a backseat to labor. Fields demanded attention, animals needed tending, and any opportunity to earn even a small amount of money was rarely ignored. Joaquin spent much of his childhood outdoors, learning the terrain intimately. He knew which paths were safe, which hills provided cover, and how to move unnoticed through rugged landscapes. These skills, learned without intention, would later prove invaluable. The mountains themselves played a silent role in shaping him. They were both barrier and refuge, isolating the village from outside influence while offering protection from intrusion. To outsiders, the region appeared desolate and inaccessible. To those who lived there, it was home, with its own rules and quiet understandings. Smuggling routes passed nearby, whispered about but rarely discussed openly. Children grew up aware that certain crops brought more money than others, and that asking too many questions was unwise. In this environment, the cultivation of poppy plants was not initially seen as criminal. It was a means of survival, encouraged indirectly by global demand and neglected governance. For many families, it offered the only reliable income. Joaquin observed this reality closely. He saw how those involved in the trade were able to buy food, tools, and clothing that others could not. The contrast between scarcity and relative comfort was unmistakable. As he grew older, the weight of expectation settled in. There was no clear path out of poverty through conventional means. Jobs were scarce, wages were low, and opportunities nearly non-existent. Ambition, in such circumstances, does not announce itself as greed. It appears as practicality. The desire to escape hunger, to assert control over one's fate, becomes powerful motivation. Family dynamics further influenced his worldview. The lack of emotional security fostered independence at an early age. Joaquin learned to rely on himself, to calculate risk quietly, and to adapt quickly. Trust was given sparingly. These traits did not develop overnight, nor were they the result of deliberate planning. They emerged naturally from a childhood shaped by instability and limited options. Stories from neighbors describe a boy who was observant rather than outspoken. He listened more than he spoke, absorbing details others overlooked. This tendency toward watchfulness would later define his approach to life. While some sought recognition, Joaquin learned that staying unnoticed often offered greater freedom. In a region where visibility could attract danger, blending into the background was a survival skill. The presence of older relatives involved in the drug trade further normalized the idea that illegal commerce was simply another profession. There was no dramatic initiation, no sudden leap into criminality. Instead, it was a gradual understanding that certain activities provided protection and income in ways legitimate work could not. The moral lines drawn by distant governments felt irrelevant in a place where survival was the primary concern. Violence, though not constant, was never far removed. Disputes were settled quickly and often without official intervention. This reinforced a sense that authority existed locally, enforced by those with power rather than by institutions. For a young boy, this reality shaped perceptions of justice and consequence. Respect was earned through strength and reliability, not through adherence to written laws. As adolescence approached, Joaquin began taking on more responsibility. Small tasks, minor roles, and errands brought him closer to the world operating just beneath the surface of village life. These were not dramatic moments, but they marked a shift. Each step deeper into that world felt logical, even inevitable. The alternative was a continuation of the same hardship he had known since birth. The contrast between the quiet beauty of the mountains and the harshness of life within them created a complex emotional landscape. There was pride in belonging to the land, but also resentment toward the limitations it imposed. Joaquin carried both. This internal tension would later manifest in a relentless drive to overcome constraints, to master the systems that once confined him. As night fell over La Tuna, the village settled into silence broken only by insects and distant sounds of nature. In these moments, dreams took shape. Not grand visions of empire, but simple desires, security, respect, and escape from hunger. These dreams, shaped in the stillness of rural nights, would quietly guide Joaquin's choices long before the world learned his name. This was the soil from which El Chapo emerged. Not chaos, but constraint. Not madness, but adaptation. A childhood defined by scarcity, discipline, and observation laid the foundation for a life that would later astonish and disturb the world. And as this story continues, it becomes clear that the shadow he would cast began forming long before he ever stepped beyond these mountains. By the time Joaquin reached his teenage years, the quiet routines of childhood had begun to shift. The mountains that once felt like a playground of survival now appeared as corridors of possibility. Paths he had walked for years, carrying tools or guiding animals, were revealed to have other purposes. Men moved through these trails at unusual hours, carrying bundles wrapped carefully, speaking little, always aware of their surroundings. Nothing was explained outright, yet everything was understood. In Badiraguato, adolescence did not come with ceremony. There were no clear milestones marking the transition into adulthood, only increasing responsibility. Joaquin began helping more frequently with labor that extended beyond the family plot. He ran errands, delivered messages, and learned how to move goods discreetly from one location to another. These early tasks were small, almost insignificant, but they introduced him to a network of relationships built on trust and silence. The cultivation of poppy plants was already deeply embedded in the region's economy. Fields were hidden in remote areas, carefully tended, and protected by the terrain itself. Joaquin observed how these operations functioned, how timing mattered, and how coordination could prevent unwanted attention. He learned that success depended not on force, but on reliability. Those who followed instructions precisely and kept their mouths shut were valued. Money, though still scarce, began to appear more consistently. It was not wealth, but it was enough to change daily life. Food became more reliable, clothing slightly better, and the constant edge of hunger softened. This contrast left a lasting impression. The connection between risk and reward became tangible, reinforcing the logic of involvement in illicit trade. What distinguished Joaquin from others his age was his discipline. While some were reckless, drawn to displays of bravado, he remained cautious. He paid attention to details others ignored, the timing of patrols, the habits of drivers, the subtle signs that indicated danger. This careful nature made him useful. Trust, once earned, grew steadily. Older figures in the trade noticed this. They did not offer mentorship in the traditional sense, but they included him in more complex tasks. He was taught how to package product, how to measure quantities accurately, and how to avoid leaving traces behind. Each lesson was practical, rooted in experience rather than theory. Mistakes were costly, and learning was swift. The environment itself reinforced these lessons. Law enforcement presence was sporadic, often compromised by corruption. When authorities did appear, word traveled quickly through informal networks. Joaquin learned how information flowed, how warnings moved faster than vehicles. This awareness of communication networks would later become central to his operations. Violence remained an undercurrent rather than a constant. When it occurred, it was swift and decisive. Joaquin witnessed the consequences of disobedience and betrayal, not as dramatic spectacles, but as quiet removals. These events reinforced a simple truth: loyalty was currency, and betrayal carried a permanent cost. Such lessons, absorbed without commentary, shaped his internal code. As his involvement deepened, Joaquin's sense of identity began to shift. He was no longer just a boy from La Tuna. He was becoming part of something larger, though still undefined. The work demanded focus and restraint. Excessive drinking, careless talk, or unnecessary attention were frowned upon. Survival favored those who remained composed. Smuggling routes extended beyond the immediate region, linking remote villages to larger networks. Joaquin participated in early transport runs, moving product from mountains to staging areas. These journeys were long and quiet, often undertaken at night. The repetitive rhythm of travel fostered reflection. He began to understand scale, not just the physical distance covered, but the reach of the trade itself. Through these experiences, he developed an appreciation for logistics. He saw how delays could create vulnerability, how efficiency reduced exposure. Each successful run reinforced confidence. Failure was not an option, it carried consequences for everyone involved. This shared risk forged bonds stronger than formal agreements. Despite his growing involvement, Joaquin maintained a low profile. He did not seek recognition or status within the group. This restraint distinguished him. Those above him valued his reliability, while peers respected his calm demeanor. Over time, he became someone others depended on, even if they did not fully understand why. The broader context of Mexico during this period further shaped his trajectory. Economic instability and limited rural development meant that opportunities remained scarce. Migration to cities or across borders was common, but not guaranteed to bring success. The illicit trade, by contrast, offered a clear path, however dangerous. For Joaquin, the choice was less about morality and more about survival. Family obligations also played a role. Earnings from his work contributed to household stability. This reinforced a sense of responsibility and justification. The line between necessity and ambition blurred. Each step deeper into the trade felt like a continuation rather than a departure from his origins. As he approached adulthood, Joaquin's reputation grew quietly. He was known as someone who completed tasks without complication. He did not attract unnecessary attention, nor did he leave unresolved problems behind. This reputation opened doors, leading to involvement in larger operations and exposure to higher-ranking figures. The mountains continued to serve as both teacher and shield. Their isolation allowed the trade to flourish while limiting external interference. Joaquin's intimate knowledge of the terrain provided advantage. He could navigate routes others found confusing, anticipate changes in weather, and identify safe locations instinctively. These skills were not taught, they were lived. By the end of this period, Joaquin was no longer experimenting with the margins of illicit activity. He was firmly embedded within it. The transition had been gradual, almost seamless. There was no single moment of decision, no dramatic crossing of a line. Instead, a series of practical choices, shaped by environment and opportunity, carried him forward. As night settled once more over Badiraguato, the young man who would later be known as El Chapo lay awake, not dreaming of power, but calculating routes, risks, and possibilities. The foundation was set. What lay ahead would elevate these early lessons to a scale few could imagine, but the principles would remain the same: move quietly, trust sparingly, and always stay one step ahead. As Joaquin moved beyond the informal networks of his youth, the world he entered began to feel less like a collection of small favors and more like an organized machine. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, Mexico's drug trade was undergoing a quiet transformation. What had once been scattered operations run by regional families was consolidating into something far more structured. At the center of this shift stood the Guadalajara cartel, a powerful alliance that brought order, hierarchy, and coordination to an industry long defined by improvisation. For Joaquin, this was not an abrupt leap, but a natural progression. His reputation for reliability and discretion made him visible to those higher up the chain. He was introduced gradually, trusted with increasingly sensitive tasks. The tone of this world was different. Decisions were deliberate, meetings controlled, and expectations clear. Mistakes carried consequences, but competence was rewarded with protection and opportunity. Under the leadership of Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo, the Guadalajara cartel operated with a level of organization that mirrored legitimate enterprises. Territories were divided, routes assigned, and profits distributed according to established agreements. Corruption was systematic rather than opportunistic, ensuring cooperation from officials who preferred predictable arrangements. This structure appealed to Joaquin's practical nature. It replaced chaos with order, reducing unnecessary risk. Within this system, Joaquin found his place not through charisma or force, but through efficiency. He was assigned to logistics and transportation, areas that required patience, precision, and constant adaptation. He learned how shipments moved across regions, how schedules were coordinated, and how small adjustments could prevent large problems. This focus on movement and flow would become his defining strength. The Guadalajara cartel's reach extended far beyond the mountains of Sinaloa. Cocaine routes from Colombia passed through Mexico on their way to the United States, transforming the scale of the trade. Joaquin witnessed firsthand how international demand reshaped local operations. What once involved small quantities now required infrastructure capable of moving tons of product. This expansion demanded trust and competence, qualities Joaquin continued to demonstrate. Interactions within the cartel reinforced lessons learned earlier. Silence was valued. Excessive attention was discouraged. Those who sought the spotlight often became liabilities. Joaquin absorbed this culture easily. He did not draw attention to himself, nor did he challenge authority openly. Instead, he positioned himself as indispensable through consistent performance. Violence, though present, was strategic rather than impulsive. Decisions to eliminate rivals or enforce discipline were calculated, intended to preserve stability. Joaquin observed how leadership maintained control not through constant aggression, but through the threat of it. This approach resonated with his own inclination toward restraint. The cartel also introduced Joaquin to a broader network of individuals, pilots, financiers, corrupt officials, and intermediaries who facilitated cross-border movement. Each role was specialized, each participant a cog in a larger machine. Joaquin learned how these pieces fit together, gaining insight into the full scope of operations. This understanding extended beyond his immediate responsibilities, allowing him to anticipate challenges and propose solutions. As trust deepened, Joaquin's responsibilities expanded. He oversaw routes, managed personnel, and coordinated shipments. These roles required not only logistical skill, but interpersonal awareness. He learned how to motivate loyalty, how to address problems quietly, and how to maintain discipline without drawing attention. His leadership style emerged subtly, rooted in competence rather than intimidation. The calm efficiency of this period masked underlying tensions. The Guadalajara cartel's power depended on balance, between rival groups, government officials, and international partners. Joaquin became aware of how fragile this balance was. Small disruptions could trigger significant consequences. This awareness fostered a cautious mindset, reinforcing the importance of adaptability. Despite the scale of operations, Joaquin maintained a relatively modest personal lifestyle. He avoided extravagance, preferring anonymity. This choice was both practical and strategic. Visibility attracted risk. By blending into the background, he reduced the likelihood of scrutiny. This approach also reinforced his image within the cartel as someone focused on the work rather than personal gain. The mentorship Joaquin received during this time was indirect. Felix Gallardo did not train him personally, but the structure he imposed provided a framework for learning. Joaquin observed how decisions were made, how alliances were maintained, and how conflicts were resolved. These observations informed his own approach, shaping a leadership philosophy centered on organization and foresight. As the cartel flourished, so did the pressures it faced. Increased profits drew attention from both rivals and law enforcement. Joaquin observed how authorities responded, how investigations unfolded, and how corruption functioned as both shield and vulnerability. He learned that reliance on compromised officials carried risks, particularly when political winds shifted. This period marked a significant evolution in Joaquin's identity. He was no longer merely participating in the trade, he was helping to shape its operations. The lessons learned here would prove foundational. The emphasis on logistics, discretion, and structured control would later distinguish his leadership style from others who relied on spectacle or fear. The Guadalajara cartel's influence created an illusion of permanence, a sense that the system could endure indefinitely. Joaquin, however, sensed the underlying instability. Power, he understood, attracted challenge. The larger the operation grew, the more fragile it became. This awareness planted seeds of preparation for a future beyond the cartel's framework. As this chapter of his life progressed, Joaquin's reputation solidified. He was seen as dependable, intelligent, and adaptable. These qualities positioned him well for what would come next, even as the old order began to show signs of strain. The world he had entered was changing, and Joaquin was changing with it. In the quiet moments between shipments and meetings, the mountains remained a constant presence. They reminded him of where he came from and why he valued invisibility. As the Guadalajara cartel approached its peak, few could foresee the events that would soon dismantle it. Fewer still could predict how Joaquin Guzman would emerge from its collapse, carrying with him the knowledge and discipline that would define his rise. The balance that had sustained the old order did not collapse in a single moment. It fractured slowly, under the weight of a tension it could no longer avoid. By the mid-1980s, the Guadalajara cartel had grown too large, too influential, and too visible to remain untouched. The systems that once protected it began to strain, and the quiet efficiency that defined its operations was replaced by a growing sense of vulnerability. For Joaquin, this period marked a turning point, one where survival required not just loyalty, but foresight. In 1985, an event occurred that sent shockwaves far beyond Mexico's borders. Enrique "Kiki" Camarena, a United States Drug Enforcement Administration agent, was kidnapped, tortured, and murdered. His death shattered any remaining illusion that the cartel could operate without consequence. International pressure intensified overnight. What had once been a regional problem became a diplomatic crisis. For those inside the organization, the atmosphere shifted from confidence to caution. The killing of Camarena was not simply an act of violence, it was a catalyst. Authorities on both sides of the border responded with unprecedented force. Investigations expanded, resources multiplied, and tolerance evaporated. The Guadalajara cartel, once protected by its structure and corruption, found itself exposed. The very visibility that had fueled its growth now threatened its existence. Within the organization, tension rose. Trust, always fragile, became strained. Meetings grew shorter, communication more guarded. Joaquin observed these changes carefully. He noted how leadership reacted under pressure, how decisions became reactive rather than strategic. The lessons were clear: stability could vanish quickly, and those unprepared would be crushed by the collapse. Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo attempted to maintain control, but the weight of scrutiny was relentless. Arrests began to ripple through the network. Safe houses were compromised, routes disrupted. Joaquin saw firsthand how interconnected the system was, and how the removal of key figures created cascading failures. This period reinforced his understanding of the importance of decentralization, a lesson that would later shape his own approach. As authorities closed in, alliances shifted. Some sought to protect themselves by cooperating quietly with law enforcement. Others attempted to assert dominance through violence, believing fear could restore order. Joaquin recognized the danger in both responses. Cooperation invited betrayal, while aggression attracted attention. He remained cautious, focusing on preserving his position rather than defending the collapsing structure. The arrest of Félix Gallardo in 1989 marked the formal end of the Guadalajara cartel, but its disintegration had begun years earlier. For those who had built their identities within its framework, this was a moment of uncertainty. Power vacuums emerged, and with them, opportunity and risk in equal measure. Joaquin understood that the end of one order often signaled the birth of another. During this period, Joaquin's adaptability proved critical. He distanced himself from centralized leadership, strengthening regional ties instead. This shift allowed him to operate with greater autonomy, reducing dependence on a single authority. It was a strategic retreat that positioned him well for the fragmentation to come. The collapse of the cartel also revealed the true nature of corruption. Officials who had once provided protection withdrew or shifted allegiance. The illusion of security vanished. Joaquin learned that reliance on external protection was inherently unstable. True security, he realized, came from control over one's own operations and the ability to disappear when necessary. Violence increased during this transitional period, not because it was planned, but because structure had dissolved. Rival groups sought to claim territory, and old agreements no longer held. Joaquin navigated this environment with care, avoiding unnecessary confrontations while consolidating influence quietly. He understood that survival depended on patience, not dominance. The broader implications of Camarina's murder extended beyond law enforcement. It altered public perception, galvanizing political will and reshaping policy. For Joaquin, these shifts underscored the interconnectedness of local actions and global consequences. A single event could transform the entire landscape, rendering previous strategies obsolete. As the old order crumbled, Joaquin began to envision a new model, one less centralized, more flexible, and better suited to an era of heightened scrutiny. He had witnessed the vulnerabilities of a monolithic structure. The future, he believed, belonged to those who could adapt, fragment, and operate in the shadows. This period also tested personal resilience. Uncertainty breeds paranoia, and paranoia erodes trust. Joaquin learned to operate with minimal reliance on others, compartmentalizing information and responsibilities. These habits, developed under pressure, would later define his leadership style. In the quiet aftermath of the cartel's collapse, the mountains regained their familiar stillness. Yet beneath that calm, new currents were forming. Joaquin stood at the threshold of a transformed landscape, armed with hard-earned lessons about power, visibility, and survival. The fall of the old order was not an end for him, but a beginning. As history moved forward, the consequences of this period would reverberate for decades. The systems dismantled in the wake of Camarina's murder would be replaced by more fragmented, adaptable networks. Joaquin Guzman, shaped by this crucible, was prepared to thrive in the chaos that followed. In the aftermath of collapse, silence returned before anything else. The arrests, the fear, the sudden absence of old hierarchies left behind a landscape that felt strangely empty. Yet in that emptiness, movement began. The territories once controlled by a single authority fractured into smaller domains, each governed by those who understood the terrain best. For Joaquin, this moment did not feel like chaos. It felt like space. The fall of centralized control allowed regional leaders to step forward, not with declarations, but with quiet coordination. Old alliances were tested, reshaped, or abandoned entirely. Trust had to be rebuilt, not on reputation alone, but on proven restraint. Joaquin aligned himself with figures who shared his understanding of discretion and long-term thinking. Among them were Hector El Guero, Palma and Ismael El Mayo Zambada, men who valued patience over spectacle. Together, they began to organize what would later be known as the Sinaloa Cartel, though at the time it was simply a network of agreements and shared interests. There was no formal announcement, no ceremony marking its creation. Instead, routes were divided, responsibilities assigned, and conflicts avoided where possible. The focus was on continuity, keeping the flow of goods steady in a rapidly changing environment. Geography played a decisive role. Sinaloa's mountains, coastlines, and proximity to key trafficking corridors provided natural advantages. Joaquin's deep familiarity with these landscapes allowed him to optimize movement and minimize exposure. He understood which paths could be trusted, which villages offered shelter, and how seasonal changes affected travel. This intimate knowledge became a cornerstone of the emerging organization. Unlike the centralized model that had preceded it, this new structure emphasized decentralization. Each region operated with a degree of autonomy, reducing the risk that a single arrest or betrayal could dismantle the entire network. Joaquin advocated for this approach, drawing on lessons learned during the Guadalajara cartel's collapse. Control was maintained through coordination rather than command. Communication was streamlined but cautious. Messages traveled through trusted intermediaries, and information was compartmentalized. No one knew more than necessary. This method limited vulnerability and reinforced accountability. It also fostered a culture of professionalism. Reliability became the primary currency, outweighing displays of loyalty or aggression. The Sinaloa organization also distinguished itself through its approach to conflict. Rather than seeking dominance through constant violence, it prioritized negotiation and strategic alliances. This did not eliminate brutality, but it reduced its frequency. Joaquin understood that excessive violence attracted attention and destabilized operations. Stability, even if temporary, was more profitable. As the network expanded, so did its reach. Routes into the United States were refined, utilizing both established corridors and innovative methods. Coastal access facilitated maritime transport, while land routes offered flexibility. Joaquin's role focused heavily on logistics, ensuring that movement remained efficient and adaptable. Each successful operation reinforced the organization's credibility. The partnership between Joaquin and his associates was pragmatic rather than sentimental. Mutual benefit defined their relationship. Disputes were handled quietly, often through intermediaries, to avoid escalation. This approach allowed the organization to grow steadily, absorbing smaller groups and negotiating coexistence with rivals. Economic considerations also shaped decisions. Profits were reinvested strategically, funding infrastructure rather than personal indulgence. Safe houses, transport vehicles, and communication systems took priority over displays of wealth. Joaquin's personal lifestyle remained relatively modest, reinforcing his preference for invisibility. The absence of a single, charismatic leader was deliberate. While Joaquin emerged as a central figure, he avoided presenting himself as the sole authority. This ambiguity protected him and the organization. If leadership appeared diffuse, it was harder for authorities to target effectively. Power flowed through networks rather than individuals. As the Sinaloa organization solidified, it attracted attention from international partners. Colombian suppliers, seeking reliable transit, recognized the group's efficiency. These relationships expanded the scale of operations, introducing new challenges and opportunities. Joaquin navigated these partnerships carefully, aware of the risks inherent in cross-border alliances. The environment in Mexico continued to evolve. Government pressure fluctuated, corruption persisted unevenly, and rival groups contested territory. Joaquin responded by emphasizing adaptability. Awareness of shifting conditions allowed the organization to retreat, reroute, or pause operations as needed. Flexibility became a defining trait. Internally, discipline was enforced through clear expectations rather than constant fear. Those who followed protocols and delivered results were protected. Those who jeopardized operations faced consequences. This balance maintained order without excessive violence, reinforcing a culture of accountability. As years passed, the Sinaloa organization's influence grew quietly. It did not announce its dominance, but its presence was felt through the consistency of its operations. Joaquin's reputation evolved accordingly. He was seen as a strategist, a planner who valued long-term stability over immediate gains. The birth of this new order marked a significant shift in the dynamics of Mexico's drug trade. It demonstrated that fragmentation could produce resilience, that networks could outlast hierarchies. Joaquin's role in shaping this model would later be recognized as one of his greatest strengths. In the stillness of the mountains, beneath the familiar stars, a new structure had taken root. It was not built on spectacle or fear, but on patience, coordination, and an intimate understanding of movement. The Sinaloa organization was not yet a global empire, but its foundation was set. And at its quiet center stood a man who preferred shadows to thrones, guiding the flow of an underworld that was learning to operate without a single crown. Power did not announce itself in Joaquin's world. It did not arrive with parades, luxury cars, or public displays meant to inspire fear or admiration. Instead, it settled quietly, almost imperceptibly, into the routines of daily life. While other figures in the underworld sought recognition, Joaquin moved in the opposite direction, deliberately shrinking his public presence as his influence expanded. This contrast became one of his most defining traits. At a time when many leaders embraced extravagance, Joaquin chose restraint. He avoided predictable habits, dressed plainly, and rarely remained in one place for long. His residences, often modest by comparison to his wealth, were selected for practicality rather than comfort. This approach confused those who expected power to be visible. To Joaquin, visibility was vulnerability. This preference for anonymity extended to how he governed. Orders were delivered indirectly, often through intermediaries who themselves knew only fragments of the larger picture. This compartmentalization protected the structure and reduced the risk of betrayal. Even trusted associates were rarely given a full view of operations. Knowledge was power, and Joaquin distributed it carefully. Despite his low profile, his authority was unquestioned within the organization. This authority did not rely on constant enforcement. It was built on consistency. Agreements were honored, payments delivered on time, and protection offered when needed. Reliability created loyalty more effectively than fear. Those who worked with Joaquin understood that as long as they fulfilled their roles, they were valued. Paranoia, however, was an ever-present companion. Success brought attention, and attention brought risk. Joaquin assumed that surveillance was constant, even when evidence was absent. This mindset shaped his daily routines. Movements were spontaneous, schedules irregular. He rarely slept in the same place consecutively. Each location was treated as temporary. Personal relationships were similarly guarded. Trust was extended cautiously, often tested repeatedly. Betrayal, when it occurred, reinforced his instinct to limit emotional attachment. The cost of closeness in such a world was high. Over time, this distance became habitual, isolating him even from allies. Yet Joaquin was not entirely detached. He understood the value of goodwill within communities. In certain regions, he provided financial assistance, supported local projects, or intervened to resolve disputes. These actions were strategic rather than charitable, fostering loyalty and silence. People protected what they felt invested in. This duality, distance from associates, connection to communities, allowed Joaquin to operate within a protective social environment. While he avoided public attention, his presence was felt locally. Stories circulated of his fairness, his generosity, and his decisiveness. Whether entirely true or embellished, these narratives strengthened his position. His leadership style favored delegation. Rather than micromanaging, Joaquin selected capable individuals and allowed them autonomy within defined boundaries. This approach reduced his exposure and empowered subordinates. It also created a buffer between him and day-to-day operations, making direct attribution more difficult. The psychological burden of such leadership was significant. Constant vigilance, limited trust, and isolation eroded any sense of normalcy. Sleep was fragmented, thoughts perpetually occupied with contingency planning. Joaquin's world was one of perpetual readiness, where relaxation was a liability. As his influence grew, so did the myths surrounding him. To some, he was an almost invisible mastermind, orchestrating events from the shadows. To others, he was a ghost, impossible to capture. Joaquin did little to correct these perceptions. Myth served as camouflage, obscuring reality and complicating pursuit. This avoidance of the spotlight stood in stark contrast to contemporaries who sought fame through media attention or overt displays of dominance. Joaquin watched as such figures became targets, their visibility hastening their downfall. Each arrest, each assassination, reinforced his belief that survival depended on remaining unseen. Even within his own organization, he resisted glorification. He discouraged the use of his name in unnecessary contexts and avoided branding operations around himself. The focus remained on function rather than identity. If one part failed, it could be replaced without exposing the whole. The paradox of Joaquin's power lay in its subtlety. He commanded vast resources and influence, yet lived as if constantly on the run. This tension defined his existence. Control over operations did not translate into personal freedom. In many ways, the higher he rose, the narrower his world became. Externally, authorities struggled to build a clear picture of him. Intelligence reports were fragmented, reliant on second-hand accounts and speculation. Joaquin's deliberate obscurity frustrated efforts to target him directly. Without consistent patterns, surveillance yielded limited results. Internally, this same obscurity created challenges. Communication delays, misunderstandings, and the need for absolute trust in intermediaries carried risks. Joaquin accepted these risks as necessary trade-offs. Direct involvement increased exposure. Distance, though imperfect, offered protection. As years passed, the legend of the unseen king grew. Stories exaggerated his reach, attributing successes and failures alike to his influence. Joaquin allowed these narratives to exist unchallenged. In the underworld, perception often mattered as much as reality. Beneath the layers of caution and strategy, there remained a man shaped by his origins. The lessons of poverty and survival continued to guide him. Excess was not just dangerous, it felt unnecessary. Security came from preparation, not display. In the quiet moments between movements, when the world outside seemed distant, Joaquin existed in a state of watchful calm. Power, to him, was not something to be enjoyed openly. It was something to be maintained, protected, and hidden. And in that concealment, he found both strength and solitude, ruling not from a throne, but from the shadows that he never allowed to lift. Silence did not mean peace. Beneath the careful restraint and calculated patience, pressure continued to build. As the Sinaloa organization expanded quietly, others watched closely. Territory, routes, and influence were finite, and growth for one group often meant loss for another. Conflict was inevitable, even if it unfolded slowly, like distant thunder rather than sudden storms. Rivalries during this period were not born from personal hatred, but from overlapping interests. The Tijuana cartel to the northwest and the Juarez cartel along the northern border controlled strategic corridors that funneled immense wealth. These regions were not merely lines on a map, they were lifelines. Whoever controlled them dictated the flow of goods into the United States. Joaquin understood that confrontation over such territory could never be avoided entirely, only delayed. The early stages of these conflicts were subtle. Routes were tested, shipments intercepted, alliances probed. Messages were sent indirectly, sometimes through intermediaries who understood the language of implication. Violence, when it occurred, was precise rather than indiscriminate. The goal was not chaos, but leverage. Cities like Tijuana and Ciudad Juarez began to feel the strain. To outsiders, daily life continued, shops opened, traffic moved, families gathered. Yet beneath this normalcy, an invisible war unfolded. Power shifted block by block, decision by decision. The calm surface masked a relentless struggle for dominance. Joaquin approached these rivalries with caution. He resisted the temptation to respond immediately to provocation. Reaction, he believed, often revealed weakness. Instead, he gathered information, assessed patterns, and waited. Patience was not passivity, it was preparation. When action became unavoidable, it was calculated. Targets were chosen for strategic impact rather than emotional satisfaction. Disrupting logistics proved more effective than direct confrontation. A delayed shipment, a compromised route, or a broken alliance could weaken a rival more reliably than open warfare. This approach minimized exposure while maximizing effect. The violence that did occur carried heavy consequences for those living in contested regions. Communities found themselves caught between forces they neither controlled nor fully understood. Fear settled quietly, altering routines and expectations. Joaquin was aware of this impact, though it rarely altered strategic decisions. In the underworld, collateral damage was an unfortunate constant rather than an anomaly. Internally, these conflicts tested loyalty and discipline. Stress revealed weaknesses. Some individuals acted recklessly, drawn into unnecessary confrontations. Joaquin responded by reinforcing structure, clarifying roles, and tightening communication. Stability within his organization became paramount. External conflict could not be allowed to erode internal cohesion. The rivalry with the Tijuana cartel, in particular, highlighted contrasting leadership styles. Where others favored overt displays of power, Joaquin continued to prioritize discretion. This difference shaped the nature of the conflict. Rather than escalating into constant open warfare, it unfolded in waves, periods of tension followed by uneasy calm. Ciudad Juarez became emblematic of these struggles. Its strategic importance made it a focal point for competing interests. Control over the city shifted, sometimes subtly, sometimes violently. Joaquin monitored these changes closely, understanding that prolonged instability attracted unwanted attention from authorities. Law enforcement presence intensified in response to rising violence. Military patrols, checkpoints, and investigations increased. Joaquin viewed this as a predictable consequence. Violence, he believed, was a spotlight. The more intense the conflict, the brighter that light became. This reinforced his preference for indirect pressure over overt aggression. Despite efforts to limit escalation, certain moments forced decisive action. When negotiations failed or boundaries were crossed, retaliation followed. These responses were swift, intended to restore balance rather than prolong conflict. The message was clear: restraint had limits. Over time, patterns emerged. Groups that relied heavily on intimidation and spectacle burned brightly but briefly. Their visibility made them targets for both rivals and authorities. Joaquin observed these outcomes carefully. Each downfall validated his belief in patience and adaptability. The psychological toll of ongoing conflict was significant. Constant alertness, contingency planning, and the knowledge that threats could emerge unexpectedly weighed heavily. Joaquin's world narrowed further. Trust became even more selective. Movement remained constant. For communities, the cost was measured in quieter ways. Curfews imposed by fear rather than law, conversations lowered, routines altered. The Underworld's battles reshaped daily life without ever being fully acknowledged. Joaquin understood this dynamic, though it rarely softened strategic calculations. As rivalries evolved, alliances shifted. Temporary understandings were reached, broken, and renegotiated. The landscape remained fluid. Joaquin navigated this environment with the same principles that had guided him from the beginning: minimize exposure, maximize control, and never mistake silence for safety. Gradually, the Sinaloa organization's approach began to yield results. Rivals weakened under sustained pressure, internal fractures, and increased scrutiny. Control over key routes stabilized, though never permanently. Joaquin did not view dominance as a fixed achievement, but as a condition requiring constant maintenance. These years reinforced a fundamental truth: power in the underworld was never absolute. It was contested, fragile, and always temporary. Survival depended not on eliminating rivals entirely, but on outlasting them. As the conflict settled into uneasy equilibrium, the silence returned, not as peace, but as pause. Beneath that stillness, tensions remained unresolved, waiting for the next shift. Joaquin remained watchful, aware that every calm carried the potential for renewed struggle. And in that quiet vigilance, he continued to shape his legacy, not through grand declarations, but through the slow, relentless management of conflict beneath the surface. Inevitability often arrives quietly. There is rarely a single moment when a long pursuit announces its end. Instead, pressure accumulates, paths narrow, and options diminish until movement becomes constrained. For Joaquin, the early 1990s carried this subtle shift. Years of careful invisibility had kept him ahead, but the world around him was changing. Violence linked to cartel conflicts had intensified scrutiny, and the patience of governments, particularly across the border, was wearing thin. The turning point did not begin with him directly. In May 1993, gunfire erupted at Guadalajara International Airport, meant for Joaquin but striking something far more destabilizing. Cardinal Juan Jesus Posadas Ocampo was killed in a chaotic burst of violence between rival groups. The assassination of a high-ranking Catholic figure shocked Mexico in a way few events ever had. Public outrage surged, and political pressure became unavoidable. What had once been tolerated or quietly ignored was suddenly unacceptable. For Joaquin, this event marked a fundamental shift. The protection once afforded by distance and discretion weakened. The government could no longer afford ambiguity. Law enforcement agencies intensified coordination, sharing intelligence across borders and jurisdictions. Joaquin understood immediately that the environment had changed. Survival now required even greater restraint. He moved constantly, relying on the habits that had kept him free for years. Safe houses were rotated, communication minimized. Yet pressure continued to mount. Associates were detained, questioned, turned. Each arrest reduced the margin for error. Joaquin sensed the tightening net, even as he attempted to slip through its openings. The pursuit extended beyond Mexico. Intelligence cooperation with the United States expanded, bringing new resources and technology to bear. Surveillance improved, and tracking became more systematic. Joaquin's network, while resilient, was not immune to sustained attention. Every system, no matter how well designed, depends on people, and people are fallible. In June 1993, Joaquin crossed into Guatemala, seeking temporary refuge. Small disruptions could trigger significant consequences. This awareness fostered a cautious mindset, reinforcing the importance of adaptability. Despite the scale of operations, Joaquin maintained a relatively modest personal lifestyle. He avoided extravagance, preferring anonymity. This choice was both practical and strategic. Visibility attracted risk. By blending into the background, he reduced the likelihood of scrutiny. This approach also reinforced his image within the cartel as someone focused on the work rather than personal gain. The mentorship Joaquin received during this time was indirect. Felix Gallardo did not train him personally, but the structure he imposed provided a framework for learning. Joaquin observed how decisions were made, how alliances were maintained, and how conflicts were resolved. These observations informed his own approach, shaping a leadership philosophy centered on organization and foresight. As the cartel flourished, so did the pressures it faced. Increased profits drew attention from both rivals and law enforcement. Joaquin observed how authorities responded, how investigations unfolded, and how corruption functioned as both shield and vulnerability. He learned that reliance on compromised officials carried risks, particularly when political winds shifted. This period marked a significant evolution in Joaquin's identity. He was no longer merely participating in the trade, he was helping to shape its operations. The lessons learned here would prove foundational. The emphasis on logistics, discretion, and structured control would later distinguish his leadership style from others who relied on spectacle or fear. The Guadalajara cartel's influence created an illusion of permanence, a sense that the system could endure indefinitely. Joaquin, however, sensed the underlying instability. Power, he understood, attracted challenge. The larger the operation grew, the more fragile it became. This awareness planted seeds of preparation for a future beyond the cartel's framework. As this chapter of his life progressed, Joaquin's reputation solidified. The move was strategic, intended to create distance from the epicenter of attention. Guatemala, at the time, offered a quieter environment, with fewer resources dedicated to tracking him. For a brief period, it seemed the plan might work. But the shift in pressure had already set events in motion. Information traveled faster than before. Tips surfaced. Patterns emerged. Joaquin's presence, once nearly impossible to pinpoint, became discernible. The very act of moving now increased exposure. On June 9, 1993, Guatemalan authorities arrested Joaquin Guzman in a hotel in Guatemala City. There was no dramatic shootout, no grand escape. The arrest was quiet, almost understated. A door closed, handcuffs clicked into place, and years of motion came to an abrupt halt. For a man defined by movement, stillness was jarring. The immediate aftermath was marked by uncertainty. Extradition loomed, though Mexico moved quickly to reclaim him. The arrest was framed publicly as a victory, a sign that even the most elusive figures could be captured. For Joaquin, it was a moment of recalibration rather than defeat. He was returned to Mexico and incarcerated, beginning a new chapter defined not by open roads and hidden tunnels, but by walls and routines. Yet even in confinement, the habits of control persisted. Joaquin assessed his environment with the same careful attention he once applied to terrain. Prison, he quickly realized, was not merely a place of punishment. It was another system, one with vulnerabilities. At first, the psychological weight of capture was heavy. The constant vigilance that had governed his life was replaced by enforced stillness. Sleep came unevenly. Thoughts circled. Yet resignation never fully set in. Joaquin did not view imprisonment as an ending, but as a condition to be managed. Outside, reactions were mixed. Rivals saw opportunity. Allies saw uncertainty. The organization he had helped build faced its first major test without his direct presence. Yet the decentralized structure he favored proved resilient. Operations continued, adjusted, adapted. The flow did not stop. Inside prison walls, Joaquin began to rebuild influence quietly. Guards were observed, routines memorized. Corruption, he knew, did not vanish at prison gates. It simply took new forms. Money still mattered. Loyalty still mattered. Information still mattered. The arrest altered his public image. Once a shadow, he was now a known figure, his face circulating in media outlets. This visibility was dangerous, but it also reinforced the myth surrounding him. For some, capture only heightened fascination. For others, it confirmed the scale of his influence. For Joaquin himself, the experience reinforced a central lesson: no system was permanent. Freedom, power, even invisibility were temporary conditions. Adaptation was the only constant. The same patience that had guided him through the mountains now guided him through confinement. As days turned into weeks, the initial shock faded. Routine settled in. Joaquin observed, listened, waited. The silence of prison was different from the silence of the mountains, but it carried similar lessons. Movement was limited, but thought remained free. What authorities believed to be an ending was, in reality, a pause. The story did not conclude with capture. It merely changed setting. Behind concrete walls and steel doors, the man who once ruled movement began preparing for stillness, and, quietly, for whatever might come next. The night outside continued as always. The mountains remained. Routes shifted. And somewhere within the confines of a cell, a figure accustomed to shadows adjusted to a new kind of darkness, already calculating how long it might last. Prison was meant to be an ending, a closing of distance and possibility. Thick walls, steel bars, and routines enforced by whistles and keys were designed to strip away autonomy. For Joaquin, the transition from constant motion to enforced stillness was profound. Yet even in confinement, he did not abandon the instincts that had kept him alive for decades. Instead, he began to study this new environment with the same quiet intensity he once applied to mountains and borders. The prison to which he was sent was not designed for someone like him. Officially, it was a place of order and control. Unofficially, it functioned according to its own informal rules. Power moved differently here, flowing through guards, administrators, and inmates alike. Joaquin understood quickly that authority inside these walls was fragmented, negotiable, and often corruptible. At first, his days followed strict routine. Head counts, meals, limited recreation. The loss of freedom was undeniable. Yet within this structure, he identified patterns. Guards rotated shifts predictably. Certain officials were more flexible than others. Inmates formed hierarchies based on influence rather than sentence length. These observations formed the foundation of his adaptation. Money remained a powerful tool. Though physically confined, Joaquin's financial resources extended far beyond prison walls. Through intermediaries, he began to exert influence subtly. Small favors were requested, granted, and reciprocated. Extra food, improved conditions, extended visits. Each concession reinforced a network of quiet cooperation. Over time, his living conditions improved. He gained access to items prohibited to most inmates, communication devices, private accommodations, and unsupervised meetings. These privileges were not flaunted. Joaquin remained discreet, understanding that visibility could provoke resentment or scrutiny. His approach was consistent: take what was necessary, reveal nothing. From within the prison, he continued to monitor external operations. Messages flowed through trusted channels, coded and fragmented to avoid detection. Joaquin did not attempt to micromanage. Instead, he focused on strategic guidance, allowing subordinates to manage daily affairs. This reinforced the decentralized model he had long favored. The prison itself became a microcosm of the world he knew. Alliances formed, rivalries simmered, and influence was negotiated quietly. Joaquin navigated this environment with caution, avoiding unnecessary conflict. His reputation preceded him, offering protection without overt aggression. Many inmates preferred coexistence to confrontation. Yet the psychological cost of confinement was significant. The absence of open space weighed heavily. Nights were long, punctuated by unfamiliar sounds and restless thoughts. Joaquin adapted by imposing structure on himself, creating routines within routines. Control, even in small forms, offered stability. Guards and officials faced their own dilemmas. Some saw Joaquin as an opportunity, others as a risk. Corruption thrived in this ambiguity. The prison administration, already strained, struggled to enforce consistent discipline. Joaquin exploited these weaknesses not through force, but through patience. Over months, his influence expanded. He became a central figure within the prison, though he avoided overt leadership. Requests passed through him. Disputes were settled with his involvement. This informal authority mirrored the role he had played outside, reinforcing his sense of continuity. Authorities outside the prison were aware of these dynamics, but addressing them proved difficult. Removing corrupt officials created instability. Increased oversight was costly and imperfect. Joaquin's ability to adapt faster than institutions frustrated attempts to isolate him fully. The illusion of containment began to crack. Reports surfaced of privileges, of continued communication, of influence extending beyond the walls. Yet evidence was often circumstantial, difficult to prove conclusively. Joaquin maintained plausible deniability, ensuring that no single action could be traced directly to him. For rivals, his imprisonment was both opportunity and warning. While he was confined, his organization remained operational. This resilience signaled that removing the figurehead was insufficient. The system he had helped build endured. Inside his cell, Joaquin remained alert. He understood that prisons were not static. Policies changed, staff rotated, attention shifted. Every change presented both risk and opportunity. He waited, observed, and planned. The idea of escape did not begin as a detailed plan. It existed as a possibility, a distant consideration. Joaquin did not rush toward it. He understood that timing was critical. Attempting too soon invited failure. Patience, once again, was essential. As years passed, complacency crept into the institution. Routines became predictable. Oversight relaxed. Joaquin noted these shifts carefully. Each small lapse accumulated, forming the outline of a future opportunity. Despite his influence, isolation remained. True trust was rare. Even those who benefited from his presence were potential liabilities. Joaquin kept emotional distance, reinforcing his reliance on strategy rather than sentiment. Prison had not diminished him, it had refined him. The constraints forced him to focus on fundamentals, observation, patience, and control. He adapted to stillness without surrendering intent. Beyond the walls, the world continued to change. New alliances formed, rivals rose and fell. Joaquin remained informed, his understanding of the broader landscape intact. Confinement had altered his circumstances, not his perspective. As time moved forward, the prison became less a cage and more a temporary station. Joaquin did not know when or how the next transition would occur, but he believed it would. The systems that confined him were imperfect, and imperfections were opportunities. In the quiet hours, when lights dimmed and the prison settled into uneasy rest, Joaquin lay awake, listening. Not for footsteps, but for patterns. Somewhere within those patterns lay a path forward, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. Time inside prison does not pass, it accumulates. Days layer upon one another until routine becomes invisible, and invisibility, when combined with familiarity, creates opportunity. For Joaquin, the years behind walls were not wasted. They were spent watching systems decay, observing how vigilance softened when nothing appeared to change. The longer he remained contained, the more predictable the environment became. The idea of escape did not emerge as fantasy or impulse. It formed slowly, shaped by repetition. Guards followed the same paths. Supervisors trusted reports they rarely verified. Procedures existed on paper, but in practice they bent under convenience and corruption. Joaquin noted every deviation, every shortcut taken in the name of efficiency. His confinement at Puente Grande prison placed him in a setting that was, paradoxically, both controlled and permeable. Officially classified as a high-security facility, it relied heavily on human enforcement rather than technological oversight. This dependence created openings. Human behavior, unlike machines, was inconsistent. Joaquin began by testing boundaries subtly. Small requests, minor privileges, insignificant on their own, revealed where resistance existed and where it did not. Over time, these concessions accumulated. Extra time outside cells. Less scrutiny during movement. Access to areas that should have been restricted. Each success reinforced a broader understanding of the institution's vulnerabilities. Communication channels remained active. Through lawyers, visitors, and compromised staff, Joaquin maintained contact with the outside. Messages were fragmented and indirect, minimizing risk. Planning required absolute secrecy. The fewer who knew, the greater the chance of success. The method chosen was deceptively simple. Not a dramatic breach of walls or armed confrontation, but disappearance. The plan relied on blending escape into routine, exploiting the prison's trust in its own procedures. The chosen moment would be one when oversight was lowest and assumptions highest. On the day of the escape in January 2001, the prison operated as it always had. There were no alarms, no unusual movements. Joaquin followed established routines, presenting nothing out of the ordinary. This normalcy was essential. Suspicion would have ruined everything. The mechanism itself, a laundry cart, was emblematic of the plan's elegance. It was mundane, unremarkable, and therefore invisible. Prison staff saw countless carts every day, their contents rarely questioned. By concealing himself within one, Joaquin transformed the ordinary into an exit. As the cart moved through corridors and checkpoints, it encountered minimal scrutiny. The assumptions built into routine did the work. Guards saw what they expected to see. The cart passed through gates that were designed to keep people in, not to question objects moving out. When Joaquin emerged beyond the prison's perimeter, there was no celebration, no dramatic flight. He vanished into a waiting network prepared to absorb him quickly. Vehicles, safe houses, and routes were already arranged. The transition from captivity to freedom was seamless, almost quiet. The realization that he was gone took time. Initial confusion gave way to disbelief, then alarm. Authorities scrambled to reconstruct events, searching for evidence that had been erased by routine. How could a man escape from a maximum security prison without detection? The question echoed far beyond Mexico. For Joaquin, the escape was not triumph, but return. Movement resumed. The stillness that had defined his imprisonment dissolved into familiar motion. Yet the experience had changed him. Prison had reinforced his belief in patience and subtlety. Loud actions attracted attention, quiet ones endured. The escape instantly reshaped his legend. To supporters, it confirmed his ingenuity. To rivals, it was a warning. To authorities, it was an embarrassment that exposed systemic failure. The myth of El Chapo expanded, fueled by the simplicity of the act. Complexity was unnecessary when predictability could be exploited. In the aftermath, pressure intensified. Joaquin understood that his freedom would be met with renewed pursuit. Yet he also knew that pursuit would be reactive, driven by urgency rather than strategy. This imbalance created opportunity. He retreated to familiar terrain, relying on networks that had been maintained in his absence. The decentralized structure proved its value. Operations resumed with minimal disruption. The system had not depended solely on his presence, and now it welcomed him back quietly. The psychological impact of the escape was profound. It reaffirmed his belief that institutions were only as strong as their weakest routines. Control was an illusion maintained by repetition and trust. Disrupt either, and the structure faltered. Authorities responded by reshuffling personnel, tightening oversight, and announcing reforms. Yet such measures were often superficial, addressing symptoms rather than causes. Joaquin observed these responses from a distance, already anticipating how they might erode over time. For communities familiar with his name, the escape became part of local lore. Stories grew with each retelling, blending fact and exaggeration. Joaquin did nothing to discourage this. Myth, once again, served as both shield and distraction. The escape also reinforced a hard truth: freedom came at a cost. Paranoia intensified. Movement became more cautious. The margin for error narrowed. Joaquin accepted these consequences. Freedom, he believed, was never absolute. It required constant defense. As he settled back into the rhythms of the outside world, the years in prison receded, but their lessons remained. Stillness had taught him patience. Confinement had revealed vulnerability. Escape had proven that simplicity could overcome complexity. In the quiet moments after his return, when the immediate urgency faded, Joaquin reflected not on the audacity of what he had done, but on its inevitability. Systems decay. Routines dull. And those who wait long enough, watching closely, eventually find a way through. Freedom, once regained, carried a different weight. It was no longer simply movement across terrain, but navigation through a world that had grown smaller, more connected, and more watchful. The years following the escape unfolded in an era shaped by technology, globalization, and rapidly shifting borders. For Joaquin, adapting to this new landscape required refinement rather than reinvention. The principles remained the same, the scale had changed. The international drug trade had evolved during his absence. Demand in the United States remained strong, but new markets had emerged across Europe, Asia, and Oceania. Supply chains stretched farther, routes grew more complex, and profits expanded accordingly. Joaquin recognized that survival now depended on thinking beyond regional corridors. The organization he helped guide would need to function as a global network. Logistics became increasingly sophisticated. Where once movement relied on physical routes alone, it now incorporated layers of financial transactions, front companies, and legal commerce. Shipping containers moved across oceans alongside legitimate goods, indistinguishable without specific intelligence. Joaquin understood the value of blending illicit operations into the rhythms of global trade. Invisibility, once achieved through isolation, was now achieved through scale. Technology introduced both opportunity and risk. Encrypted communications allowed faster coordination across continents, while digital surveillance posed new threats. Joaquin approached these tools cautiously, aware that reliance on any single system could create vulnerability. Devices were rotated, codes changed, and communication minimized. Silence remained as important as connectivity. The organization expanded its relationships with suppliers and distributors worldwide. Colombian producers continued to play a central role, but new partnerships emerged. Joaquin navigated these alliances pragmatically, prioritizing reliability over loyalty. Global operations required flexibility. No partnership was permanent, all were conditional. Financial infrastructure became a central focus. Laundering profits through legitimate businesses demanded expertise and patience. Banks, shell companies, and investments formed a parallel system that mirrored lawful economies. Joaquin delegated these tasks to specialists, understanding that complexity itself could be protective. Tracing money through layered transactions required resources many agencies lacked. Despite the growing scale, Joaquin maintained his preference for decentralization. Regional cells operated semi-independently, reducing the risk of total collapse. Each node could adapt to local conditions, responding to enforcement efforts without waiting for centralized directives. This structure reflected lessons learned from earlier failures. As the organization's reach expanded, so did its reputation. Joaquin's name became synonymous with efficiency and reliability among international partners. Yet he continued to avoid public exposure. He resisted efforts to brand operations around his identity, preferring anonymity. Fame, he believed, was a liability. Authorities, however, were adapting as well. International cooperation improved, intelligence sharing agreements expanded, and technology enhanced tracking capabilities. Joaquin was aware that his margin for error was shrinking. The same globalization that facilitated expansion also facilitated pursuit. To mitigate this, he emphasized constant movement and compartmentalization. Safe houses spanned multiple countries. Travel plans shifted frequently. No location was permanent. Even trusted associates rarely knew his whereabouts. This perpetual motion, while exhausting, provided security. The psychological toll of this existence deepened. Freedom without stability was a different kind of confinement. Joaquin's world consisted of transient spaces, guarded interactions, and relentless vigilance. Moments of calm were fleeting. Yet he accepted this as the cost of survival. Communities and regions where the organization operated felt the impact of its growth. Economic influence increased, as did dependency. Joaquin continued to balance enforcement with strategic generosity, maintaining support where necessary. These relationships reinforced silence and cooperation. Rival groups adjusted their strategies in response to the organization's expansion. Some sought alliances, others escalated conflict. Joaquin responded selectively, avoiding unnecessary entanglements. Global reach demanded restraint, local conflicts could no longer be allowed to disrupt international operations. The myth surrounding Joaquin evolved alongside the organization. Media narratives portrayed him as a mastermind operating beyond borders, a symbol of transnational crime. These portrayals both exaggerated and obscured reality. Joaquin allowed them to persist, understanding that perception could distract from substance. Internally, leadership dynamics shifted. New figures emerged, old ones receded. Joaquin's role became increasingly strategic rather than operational. He focused on long-term positioning, anticipating changes in enforcement, market demand, and political climates. The world he navigated was more complex than ever. Every advantage carried a corresponding risk. Technology that enabled coordination also enabled surveillance. Global trade that concealed shipments also created trails. Joaquin's strategy centered on balance, constantly adjusting to maintain equilibrium. Despite the scale of operations, unpredictability remained a constant threat. Betrayal, error, or chance could disrupt even the most carefully designed systems. Joaquin accepted this uncertainty as inherent. Control was always partial, never absolute. As years passed, the organization's global presence solidified. Routes spanned continents, finances flowed through intricate channels, and operations adapted continuously. Joaquin remained at the center, not as a visible commander, but as a guiding influence. In quiet moments, he reflected on how far the network had extended from the mountains of his childhood. What began as local survival had transformed into a global enterprise, shaped by forces far beyond any single individual. Yet at its core, the same principles endured: patience, adaptability, and invisibility. The world slept unaware of the paths goods traveled beneath its surface. And in that unseen movement, Joaquin continued to operate, navigating a global underworld with the same quiet precision that had once guided him through narrow mountain trails. Attention has a way of arriving slowly, then all at once. For years, Joaquin had relied on obscurity as his greatest defense, allowing systems to operate without drawing focus to the individual behind them. But as the organization's reach expanded across continents, invisibility became harder to maintain. Success, when repeated long enough, leaves traces. And traces invite curiosity. The shift began subtly, almost imperceptibly. Intelligence agencies compiled patterns, analysts compared notes, and journalists followed rumors. Names that once circulated only in hushed conversations began appearing in reports and headlines. Joaquin noticed the change not through headlines, but through the behavior of those around him. Associates grew nervous. Communication tightened. Questions increased. The moment his name appeared on international rankings of criminal wealth marked a significant turning point. Lists published by business magazines were meant to quantify influence, but they also transformed it into spectacle. Joaquin understood immediately the danger of such visibility. Numbers simplified complexity, turning an intricate network into a single target. Fame, even of this kind, was exposure. Media portrayals shifted the narrative. El Chapo was no longer a distant figure in law enforcement files, he became a character in global storytelling. Documentaries, articles, and commentary framed him as a symbol of unchecked criminal power. Each retelling added layers to the myth, often blurring fact and exaggeration. Joaquin did nothing to correct these portrayals. Engaging with them would only deepen the spotlight. The fascination had consequences. Authorities faced increased public pressure to demonstrate action. International partners demanded results. Resources were allocated, task forces formed, and timelines shortened. The hunt for Joaquin became not just a matter of enforcement, but of reputation. This shift altered the dynamics of pursuit. Investigations became more aggressive, less patient. Where once authorities observed quietly, they now intervened more frequently. Joaquin recognized this change as both threat and opportunity. Increased pressure often led to mistakes, on both sides. Within his organization, the impact of attention was immediate. Operations were scrutinized more closely. Financial transactions faced greater oversight. Routes once considered safe were compromised. Joaquin responded by further decentralizing, fragmenting operations to reduce traceability. The psychological effect of fame weighed heavily. Anonymity, once carefully cultivated, was eroding. Joaquin's movements required even greater caution. Safe houses multiplied. Travel windows narrowed. The sense of being watched intensified, even in moments of apparent calm. Rivals also reacted to the spotlight. Some sought to exploit the attention, positioning themselves as alternatives or collaborators. Others attempted to draw focus away from their own activities by feeding information. The environment grew more volatile. Trust became even scarcer. Joaquin's relationship with technology grew more strained. Digital communication, though efficient, felt increasingly risky. He reduced usage, favoring intermediaries and face-to-face exchanges despite the dangers. Convenience, he believed, was the enemy of security. The communities that once offered quiet shelter felt the pressure as well. Increased military presence, raids, and checkpoints disrupted daily life. Support wavered under fear. Joaquin understood that goodwill could not withstand sustained scrutiny indefinitely. He adjusted expectations accordingly. The irony of the situation was not lost on him. Years of restraint and invisibility had built an empire that now demanded attention by its sheer scale. Success had made concealment more difficult. The very efficiency that defined the organization now worked against it. Joaquin responded by narrowing his own role further. He withdrew from direct involvement, relying on trusted figures to manage operations. This distance reduced exposure but increased isolation. Decision-making became more abstract, filtered through layers of communication. Despite these precautions, the sense of inevitability grew. Attention, once fixed, rarely dissipates quickly. Joaquin understood that his margin for error was diminishing. Each decision carried greater consequence. Media narratives continue to evolve, framing him as both mastermind and folk figure. Some stories emphasized violence, others romanticized resistance to authority. Joaquin rejected both interpretations. He saw himself neither as hero nor villain, but as participant in a system larger than any individual. As the spotlight intensified, internal tensions surfaced. Stress revealed fractures. Some associates made reckless choices, drawn by fear or ambition. Joaquin addressed these issues quietly, reinforcing discipline and removing liabilities when necessary. The world beyond his control moved relentlessly. Political changes, technological advances, and shifting alliances altered the landscape faster than before. Joaquin adapted as best he could, but adaptation now required constant recalibration. In private moments, he reflected on the cost of visibility. Power without anonymity felt fragile. Every rumor, every article, every ranking narrowed his options. Yet retreat was impossible. The system could not simply be dismantled. The chase, once diffuse, had become personal. Authorities spoke his name openly. The hunt had a face. Joaquin accepted this reality with a mixture of resignation and resolve. He had always known that shadows do not last forever. As attention converged, the rhythm of his life changed. Movement became more cautious, silence deeper. The world was watching, and in that gaze lay the beginning of the end of the era he had navigated so carefully. Pressure, once diffuse, began to take shape with purpose. The pursuit that had followed Joaquin for years evolved into something more disciplined, more patient, and far more coordinated than before. This was no longer a scattered effort driven by headlines alone. It was a methodical campaign, shaped by analysts, technicians, and quiet observers who understood that speed was less important than certainty. Authorities learned from past failures. Loud raids and rushed operations had yielded little beyond temporary disruption. This time, the strategy emphasized endurance. Surveillance replaced confrontation. Data replaced rumor. Joaquin sensed this shift not through announcements, but through absence. Fewer sudden moves. Less visible pressure. A calm that felt deliberate rather than accidental. Intelligence agencies on both sides of the border deepened their cooperation. Information flowed steadily between units that once operated in isolation. Financial records, intercepted communications, and movement patterns were layered together, forming a composite picture that no single source could provide. Joaquin understood that the world had entered an age where invisibility was harder to maintain. Every action left a trace somewhere. Technology played a central role. Signals intelligence, satellite imagery, and digital analysis allowed authorities to detect patterns invisible to the human eye. Joaquin responded by reducing his own reliance on devices, but he knew this was only a partial solution. Others around him still used technology. Each message, each call, carried risk beyond his direct control. The hunt narrowed its focus. Rather than targeting the entire organization, investigators concentrated on the man at its center. They studied his habits, his history, his preferences. They looked for consistency in a life built on avoiding it. Joaquin countered by constantly changing routines, but constant change itself can become a pattern. Movement became more exhausting. Safe houses were used briefly, then abandoned. Travel was unpredictable, often undertaken at inconvenient hours. Joaquin accepted the discomfort as necessary, but the strain accumulated. Rest was fragmented. Trust grew thinner. Each decision demanded calculation. Authorities avoided direct engagement, allowing Joaquin to believe he remained unseen. This restraint was intentional. By minimizing disruption, they encouraged normalcy, hoping he would eventually relax his guard. Joaquin sensed the possibility of such a strategy and resisted it, but vigilance is difficult to sustain indefinitely. Financial tracking intensified. Banks flagged unusual activity, shell companies faced scrutiny, and money trails grew harder to obscure. Joaquin adjusted by increasing complexity, adding layers, spreading risk. Yet each layer introduced new points of failure. Complexity protected and endangered in equal measure. The human element remained the greatest vulnerability. Associates grew weary, anxious, or careless. Some talked more than they should have. Others made small mistakes that seemed insignificant in isolation. Authorities collected these fragments patiently, assembling them over time. In rural areas, the presence of security forces increased subtly. Patrols became more frequent but less aggressive. Checkpoints appeared and disappeared without warning. Joaquin read these movements like weather patterns, interpreting intent through behavior rather than statements. The hunt extended into everyday life. Suppliers hesitated. Routes closed temporarily. Communication slowed. Joaquin compensated by diversifying, but each adjustment reduced efficiency. The system continued to function, but with greater friction. Despite the tightening net, Joaquin remained elusive. False leads frustrated investigators. Safe houses turned out to be empty. Movement patterns shifted just enough to evade capture. The hunt became a contest of endurance, patience against patience. The psychological weight of being pursued so closely was immense. Joaquin lived with the constant awareness that any moment could be the one when calculation failed. Sleep came lightly. Silence felt heavy. Yet he did not panic. Panic, he believed, was fatal. Authorities refined their approach further, narrowing the circle. They studied those closest to Joaquin, mapping relationships and dependencies. Rather than forcing entry, they waited for convergence, when multiple threads aligned. This long hunt reshaped Joaquin's understanding of control. He had always known it was partial, but now its limits were clearer. Even the most careful planning could not eliminate chance. Randomness, amplified by scale, became a factor no strategy could fully address. As months passed, the pressure did not relent. It intensified quietly, invisibly. Joaquin continued to move, to adapt, to plan. Yet beneath the discipline lay an understanding that the margin was shrinking. The pursuit had become patient, intelligent, and relentless. And for the first time in many years, Joaquin faced an adversary that matched his own endurance. The quiet hunt was nearing its moment of convergence, though neither side could yet say where or when it would occur. Pressure, once diffuse, began to take shape with purpose. The pursuit that had followed Joaquin for years evolved into something more disciplined, more patient, and far more coordinated than before. This was no longer a scattered effort driven by headlines alone. It was a methodical campaign, shaped by analysts, technicians, and quiet observers who understood that speed was less important than certainty. Authorities learned from past failures. Loud raids and rushed operations had yielded little beyond temporary disruption. This time, the strategy emphasized endurance. Surveillance replaced confrontation. Data replaced rumor. Joaquin sensed this shift not through announcements, but through absence. Fewer sudden moves. Less visible pressure. A calm that felt deliberate rather than accidental. Intelligence agencies on both sides of the border deepened their cooperation. Information flowed steadily between units that once operated in isolation. Financial records, intercepted communications, and movement patterns were layered together, forming a composite picture that no single source could provide. Joaquin understood that the world had entered an age where invisibility was harder to maintain. Every action left a trace somewhere. Technology played a central role. Signals intelligence, satellite imagery, and digital analysis allowed authorities to detect patterns invisible to the human eye. Joaquin responded by reducing his own reliance on devices, but he knew this was only a partial solution. Others around him still used technology. Each message, each call, carried risk beyond his direct control. The hunt narrowed its focus. Rather than targeting the entire organization, investigators concentrated on the man at its center. They studied his habits, his history, his preferences. They looked for consistency in a life built on avoiding it. Joaquin countered by constantly changing routines, but constant change itself can become a pattern. Movement became more exhausting. Safe houses were used briefly, then abandoned. Travel was unpredictable, often undertaken at inconvenient hours. Joaquin accepted the discomfort as necessary, but the strain accumulated. Rest was fragmented. Trust grew thinner. Each decision demanded calculation. Authorities avoided direct engagement, allowing Joaquin to believe he remained unseen. This restraint was intentional. By minimizing disruption, they encouraged normalcy, hoping he would eventually relax his guard. Joaquin sensed the possibility of such a strategy and resisted it, but vigilance is difficult to sustain indefinitely. Financial tracking intensified. Banks flagged unusual activity, shell companies faced scrutiny, and money trails grew harder to obscure. Joaquin adjusted by increasing complexity, adding layers, spreading risk. Yet each layer introduced new points of failure. Complexity protected and endangered in equal measure. The human element remained the greatest vulnerability. Associates grew weary, anxious, or careless. Some talked more than they should have. Others made small mistakes that seemed insignificant in isolation. Authorities collected these fragments patiently, assembling them over time. Such lessons, absorbed without commentary, shaped his internal code. As his involvement deepened, Joaquin's sense of identity began to shift. He was no longer just a boy from La Tuna. He was becoming part of something larger, though still undefined. The work demanded focus and restraint. Excessive drinking, careless talk, or unnecessary attention were frowned upon. Survival favored those who remained composed. Smuggling routes extended beyond the immediate region, linking remote villages to larger networks. Joaquin participated in early transport runs, moving product from mountains to staging areas. These journeys were long and quiet, often undertaken at night. The repetitive rhythm of travel fostered reflection. He began to understand scale, not just the physical distance covered, but the reach of the trade itself. Through these experiences, he developed an appreciation for logistics. He saw how delays could create vulnerability, how efficiency reduced exposure. Each successful run reinforced confidence. Failure was not an option, it carried consequences for everyone involved. This shared risk forged bonds stronger than formal agreements. Despite his growing involvement, Joaquin maintained a low profile. He did not seek recognition or status within the group. This restraint distinguished him. Those above him valued his reliability, while peers respected his calm demeanor. Over time, he became someone others depended on, even if they did not fully understand why. The broader context of Mexico during this period further shaped his trajectory. Economic instability and limited rural development meant that opportunities remained scarce. Migration to cities or across borders was common, but not guaranteed to bring success. The illicit trade, by contrast, offered a clear path, however dangerous. For Joaquin, the choice was less about morality and more about survival. Family obligations also played a role. Earnings from his work contributed to household stability. This reinforced a sense of responsibility and justification. In rural areas, the presence of security forces increased subtly. Patrols became more frequent but less aggressive. Checkpoints appeared and disappeared without warning. Joaquin read these movements like weather patterns, interpreting intent through behavior rather than statements. The hunt extended into everyday life. Suppliers hesitated. Routes closed temporarily. Communication slowed. Joaquin compensated by diversifying, but each adjustment reduced efficiency. The system continued to function, but with greater friction. Despite the tightening net, Joaquin remained elusive. False leads frustrated investigators. Safe houses turned out to be empty. Movement patterns shifted just enough to evade capture. The hunt became a contest of endurance, patience against patience. The psychological weight of being pursued so closely was immense. Joaquin lived with the constant awareness that any moment could be the one when calculation failed. Sleep came lightly. Silence felt heavy. Yet he did not panic. Panic, he believed, was fatal. Authorities refined their approach further, narrowing the circle. They studied those closest to Joaquin, mapping relationships and dependencies. Rather than forcing entry, they waited for convergence, when multiple threads aligned. This long hunt reshaped Joaquin's understanding of control. He had always known it was partial, but now its limits were clearer. Even the most careful planning could not eliminate chance. Randomness, amplified by scale, became a factor no strategy could fully address. As months passed, the pressure did not relent. It intensified quietly, invisibly. Joaquin continued to move, to adapt, to plan. Yet beneath the discipline lay an understanding that the margin was shrinking. The pursuit had become patient, intelligent, and relentless. And for the first time in many years, Joaquin faced an adversary that matched his own endurance. The quiet hunt was nearing its moment of convergence, though neither side could yet say where or when it would occur. The day began like any other, yet it carried a tension that few could recognize in advance. For Joaquin, years of careful planning, constant movement, and meticulous concealment had reduced his life to a series of calculated decisions, each step measured, each location temporary. Even in freedom, vigilance never relaxed. The world had changed since his last escape, and so had the forces pursuing him. By 2014, international intelligence networks had matured, and the tools available to law enforcement had become both precise and patient. Joaquin understood that inevitability, when it comes for the relentless, does not always arrive suddenly, it creeps, calculates, and finally closes the net. It was in the coastal city of Mazatlan that the culmination of these efforts occurred. Mazatlan, with its tourist beaches, bustling port, and vibrant city life, offered a deceptive cover. Amid the crowds, the sound of the ocean, and the rhythm of daily commerce, one could appear invisible. This anonymity, however, could be pierced with the right combination of patience, information, and coordination. Joaquin had chosen Mazatlan not for its glamour, but for its strategic advantage, a city where movement was easier to conceal and the network of loyal associates provided layers of protection. Yet even the best-laid plans can be outmatched by a patient adversary. Authorities had been monitoring his movements for weeks, compiling an intricate web of intelligence. They combined financial records, phone taps, aerial surveillance, and informant reports, gradually piecing together patterns that even Joaquin, with all his caution, could not fully obscure. Every decision he had made left a trace, sometimes a small one, imperceptible in isolation, but when layered with other fragments, a clear picture began to emerge. The system that had protected him for decades was vulnerable to its own complexity, and his pursuers were exploiting this patiently, methodically. On the morning of his capture, Joaquin moved through the familiar routines he had long mastered. Safe houses were temporary, vehicles rotated, and intermediaries carried messages cautiously. Yet even these well-practiced maneuvers could not completely erase the traces left by repeated actions. Observers noted his patterns, subtle as they were, the timing of arrivals and departures, the choice of streets, the faces accompanying him. These clues, when analyzed collectively, revealed more than he anticipated. The operation itself was executed with calculated precision. Law enforcement teams, working in coordination with federal units, approached from multiple angles to ensure minimal risk of escape or resistance. Joaquin, always alert and quick to react, was momentarily unprepared for the sudden convergence. In these instances, preparation can only carry one so far. The inevitability of human systems and timing had finally caught up with him. When the arrest occurred, it was quiet, almost unceremonious. No dramatic shootout, no high-speed chase, no cinematic confrontation. Just a measured intervention in a nondescript location, a modest residence in a city filled with distractions and ordinary life. The simplicity of the moment belied the years of careful maneuvering that had led up to it. For a man who had evaded capture multiple times, the abruptness of the end was remarkable in its understated execution. The arrest was coordinated to minimize public exposure and collateral risk. Witnesses were managed, personnel positioned strategically, and the transition from freedom to confinement conducted efficiently. In Joaquin's world, control over perception was as crucial as control over movement. By neutralizing potential surprises, authorities ensured that the event proceeded with minimal complications, a reflection of the same precision he had long relied upon in his own operations. Once detained, Joaquin was transported to a secure location, his personal effects catalogued, his communications cut off. The abrupt shift from operational freedom to enforced stillness was jarring. Years of movement, adaptability, and control condensed into a few moments of confinement. Yet even in this transition, his mind remained alert, assessing surroundings, noting routines, calculating potential openings. Vigilance had become instinctual, inescapable, even when the options for action had vanished. For the organization he had built, the immediate implications were profound but contained. Thanks to the decentralized network he had cultivated, operations continued with minimal disruption. Key personnel assumed responsibilities, routes were adjusted, and contingency plans activated. The system he had designed was resilient, capable of absorbing the removal of its central figure. This resilience reflected not only his strategic foresight but also his understanding of human behavior and the necessity of redundancy. Public reaction was immediate. News of his arrest dominated headlines across Mexico and abroad. Authorities framed the operation as a triumph, emphasizing coordination, planning, and the dismantling of a major threat. For many, Joaquin's capture symbolized the end of an era, a demonstration that even the most elusive and influential figures could be contained. Yet for those who understood the inner workings of his empire, it was only a pause, a temporary shift in the balance of control. The psychological effect on Joaquin must have been profound, though he rarely allowed it to manifest outwardly. A life spent moving constantly, relying on anticipation and observation, suddenly constrained by walls, guards, and schedules, was a dramatic reversal. Yet he had adapted to confinement before, during his years at Puente Grande. The lessons learned from earlier imprisonment, patience, subtlety, observation, remained tools even in this new setting. As he was processed and relocated to secure facilities, every detail of the procedure reinforced lessons in discipline and control. Guards' routines, security protocols, and responses were noted, catalogued, and analyzed. The environment of Mazatlan, once a place of refuge and anonymity, became a controlled stage where every variable was managed by others. Joaquin, trained in manipulating and anticipating such variables, now faced the inverse, a world where the rules were external and immutable. For international authorities, the capture was both strategic and symbolic. Joaquin had not only evaded Mexican law enforcement but had also resisted U.S. extradition pressures for years. His apprehension signaled a coordinated effort across borders, a demonstration that global persistence and patient intelligence could overcome even the most adaptive and elusive criminal actors. Yet within this triumph lay subtle caution: removing the figurehead did not dismantle decades of infrastructure. Networks, loyalty, and entrenched influence remained, necessitating ongoing vigilance. In the immediate aftermath, the arrest served multiple purposes. Domestically, it reinforced governmental authority and public perception of control. Internationally, it demonstrated cooperative law enforcement capabilities. Within Joaquin's organization, it triggered reassessment, adaptation, and continuity planning. For Joaquin himself, it marked a return to the kind of stillness he had navigated before, though the stakes were now higher and the scrutiny more intense. Ultimately, the capture in Mazatlan was not the dramatic fall many imagined. It was a precise, deliberate, and controlled event that reflected both the skill of authorities and the reality of years spent being hunted. For Joaquin, it was another chapter in a life defined by movement, strategy, and adaptation. The mountains, the safe houses, the networks, all had been a school in resilience. Now, confronted with confinement once more, he would need to rely not on escape alone, but on the same principles of patience, observation, and calculated adaptation that had guided him for decades. Confinement is never absolute. Walls, bars, and steel doors can restrict movement, but they cannot completely contain ingenuity. For Joaquin, the period following his 2014 capture was defined not by resignation, but by calculation. Years of experience navigating terrain, managing networks, and anticipating risks had instilled in him a patient, methodical approach to challenges. Even in prison, every detail of his surroundings was observed, catalogued, and analyzed for opportunity. He had long understood that vulnerabilities are often created by routine, oversight, and human complacency. Puente Grande, the prison to which he had been transferred, was nominally secure. Surveillance cameras, controlled access points, and layers of personnel suggested impenetrability. Yet Joaquin quickly identified inconsistencies that others overlooked. Guards rotated predictably. Maintenance schedules created unmonitored windows. Staff were subject to the same fatigue, distraction, and lapses that humans naturally produce. In this environment, he began to consider possibilities, not impulsively, but as part of a long-term strategy. The idea of escape was never urgent, it was tactical. Joaquin understood that patience was as critical inside prison walls as it had been while evading authorities outside. He began small, testing boundaries with subtle maneuvers, exploiting minor lapses in protocol. Observing behavior, noting reactions, and tracking routines became a daily exercise. These incremental insights accumulated into a comprehensive understanding of the facility's vulnerabilities. In addition to observation, he leveraged human networks. Staff with access to restricted areas, intermediaries in the outside world, and inmates whose loyalty could be earned through subtle influence became components of a complex plan. Each individual was assessed for reliability, incentive, and risk. The construction of opportunity required absolute discretion. Knowledge had to be fragmented to prevent compromise. The fewer who understood the full plan, the higher the probability of success. The physical aspect of escape demanded ingenuity. Conventional routes, gates, walls, and perimeter fences, were heavily monitored. Joaquin looked elsewhere, to spaces that were ignored, underestimated, or assumed to be mundane. Laundry areas, service tunnels, and maintenance passages offered avenues that merged with daily routine. By integrating escape into normal operations, the act could unfold with minimal external attention. The tunnel itself became central to the strategy. Its conception required detailed planning, structural knowledge, and precise execution. Measurements, ventilation, materials, and discrete access points were all considered carefully. Construction was conducted incrementally, often under the guise of routine maintenance or other innocuous activity. Workers involved were compartmentalized, each understanding only their portion of the project, reducing risk of exposure. Time was a critical component. The tunnel could not be rushed without jeopardizing the entire operation. Secrecy extended to timing. Every external variable, from staff rotations to inspection schedules to environmental conditions, was factored into a plan that balanced patience with opportunity. Escapes fail when ambition exceeds preparation. Joaquin's methodical approach reflected decades of experience where hasty decisions had proved fatal or costly. When the moment arrived, the operation unfolded with calculated precision. Daily routines masked extraordinary activity. Movement through corridors, interaction with staff, and the transportation of equipment all proceeded in a manner consistent with expectation. By blending the extraordinary into the ordinary, attention remained diverted. Routine, which often breeds complacency, became a tool of concealment. The culmination of these efforts occurred beneath the prison floor. The tunnel, carefully concealed, led to an exit that emerged outside the perimeter of the facility. Even here, the design accounted for contingencies. Lighting, ventilation, and path reinforcement ensured that progress was steady and safe. The escape was not reliant on speed alone. It was a demonstration of meticulous planning and patience, transforming physical engineering into an extension of strategy. Once outside, coordination with the external network ensured immediate absorption into safe houses and secure locations. Vehicles, personnel, and communication channels were pre-arranged, allowing transition from confinement to mobility without pause. Years of experience managing logistics on a global scale informed the rapidity and efficiency of this phase. Every step reinforced principles that had guided him since the mountains of Sinaloa: preparation, adaptability, and the exploitation of opportunity. The response from authorities was swift, but largely reactive. Investigators, facing the realization of the tunnel's existence and the sophistication of its construction, confronted both operational failure and the challenge of reconstructing events after the fact. Joaquin's patience had created an execution so seamless that immediate detection was impossible. The escape was a study in precision, timing, and the exploitation of systemic weaknesses. Psychologically, the event solidified Joaquin's own understanding of risk and resilience. Confinement, he recognized, is a state, not a limit. Vulnerability arises from assumptions, predictability, and reliance on systems taken for granted. The escape demonstrated that even heavily monitored environments are permeable to those who combine observation, patience, and strategy. For the organization he left behind, the implications were immediate and long-term. While leadership was temporarily displaced, the decentralized structure allowed operations to continue. Routes adjusted, personnel were mobilized, and continuity preserved. The escape, while dramatic in execution, did not destabilize the enterprise. Instead, it reinforced the notion that systems matter more than individual presence. The myth of Joaquin Guzman grew in proportion to the audacity and precision of the escape. Stories circulated of the tunnel, its length, its sophistication, and the ingenuity required to execute it. To the public, it was almost cinematic; to law enforcement, a humbling testament to the persistence of a man who had long been defined by patience and calculation. Even after regaining freedom, Joaquin's approach remained consistent. Movement was measured, discretion paramount, and routines varied to avoid detection. The escape had demonstrated the capacity for ingenuity under constraint, but it also reinforced the necessity of constant vigilance. Each subsequent action had to be tempered with awareness of surveillance, intelligence, and potential compromise. In reflecting upon the tunnel and its construction, it becomes clear that the escape was not merely an act of defiance, but an extension of principles that had guided him for decades. Observation, preparation, patience, and adaptability were as critical underground as they had been on mountain trails or across international networks. The environment had changed, but the approach remained unchanged. Ultimately, the tunnel beneath Puente Grande represented both physical liberation and intellectual mastery. It was the culmination of long-term planning, careful observation, and precise execution. Every element, from the smallest calculation of distance to the management of human variables, reflected a mindset honed over a lifetime. For Joaquin, the escape was less a dramatic flourish than a natural outcome of the methods, discipline, and strategy that had defined him from the very beginning. Even the most carefully constructed systems have limits. For Joaquin, the exhilaration of freedom after the tunnel escape was tempered by the reality that vigilance alone could not guarantee indefinite elusiveness. By 2016, the relentless pressure of international law enforcement had reached a new level of coordination and sophistication. Intelligence sharing between Mexican authorities, the United States, and other international partners had matured into a constant, methodical campaign. Patterns, no matter how subtle, were detected, networks, no matter how dispersed, were analyzed, and patience, long his ally, became a double-edged sword. The final apprehension occurred in Los Mochis, a city on the northern coast of Sinaloa, known for its proximity to the mountains and its intricate urban networks. Joaquin had returned to familiar territory, relying on loyalty, terrain knowledge, and the support of a well-established organization. The location offered strategic advantages, safe houses, escape routes, and trusted intermediaries, but it also contained the vulnerability of predictability. Years of movement, routine behavior, and even the smallest patterns were now scrutinized by intelligence experts who had studied him for decades. In this context, familiarity itself became a trap. Weeks of surveillance preceded the arrest. Authorities observed his habits, the flow of personnel, and the use of vehicles. Intercepted communications provided fragments of activity that, when combined, offered a mosaic of his daily life. Even subtle choices, such as which streets he traveled, what times he visited particular residences, or the manner in which his network interacted, became critical data points. Joaquin, aware of the dangers inherent in predictability, constantly varied his movements, but intelligence teams compensated by layering observation, using multiple sources to eliminate uncertainty. On the morning of the capture, the operation was executed with precision. Coordinated units approached simultaneously from multiple points, ensuring containment and reducing opportunities for flight. This was not a chaotic confrontation, it was a carefully choreographed intervention designed to neutralize the target while minimizing risk to both personnel and bystanders. Joaquin, trained to anticipate irregularities and prepared for contingencies, was confronted with a force equal to his patience and strategy, but larger in scope, coordinated in execution, and informed by years of data accumulation. The arrest itself was subdued yet decisive. There was no high-speed chase through urban streets, no dramatic gunfire, no cinematic pursuit. Joaquin was escorted from the premises under controlled conditions, and his environment was rapidly secured. The precision of the operation reflected lessons learned from past failures. Authorities had adapted, combining strategy, intelligence, and timing in a manner that neutralized his usual advantages. Upon capture, he was immediately placed under heightened security. The transition from freedom to confinement was rapid, leaving little opportunity for negotiation or improvisation. Where he had previously relied on movement, secrecy, and networks, these tools were suddenly limited by walls, personnel, and monitoring systems. Yet even in these conditions, Joaquin's mind remained active, assessing routines, observing patterns, and planning contingencies. Vigilance had become instinctive. The apprehension sent immediate ripples through the organization he had built. While leadership was temporarily disrupted, the decentralized structure ensured continuity. Regional cells adapted, routes were rerouted, and operational protocols adjusted. This resilience, long established under his guidance, mitigated the impact of his absence. The network continued, demonstrating that systems, once carefully constructed, can endure even when central figures are removed. For authorities, the capture represented not only a tactical victory but also a symbolic achievement. Joaquin's decades-long ability to evade capture had made him a figure of international notoriety. His arrest illustrated the power of coordinated, patient, and intelligence-driven operations. Yet it also highlighted the enduring challenge of dismantling complex networks. Removing one individual, no matter how central, does not automatically dissolve a system built on distributed authority, loyalty, and redundancy. Psychologically, the moment of capture was significant. Joaquin, accustomed to anticipation and control, faced a situation where agency was curtailed. Every movement, every interaction, was now monitored. The world he had navigated with precision had been replaced by a controlled environment governed by rules he could not bend. The experience demanded adaptation, patience, and discipline of a different kind, a transition from operational freedom to strategic endurance. Public reaction was immediate and intense. Media coverage emphasized the culmination of years of pursuit, framing the event as the definitive capture of one of the most notorious figures in modern organized crime. For many, Joaquin's arrest symbolized the closing of a chapter, a triumph of law enforcement over persistence, ingenuity, and elusiveness. Yet within these narratives, the complexities of the network he created were often overlooked. Systems endure. Influence persists. Operations continue. Internally, Joaquin confronted the reality that past tactics, movement, invisibility, and careful delegation, could no longer shield him. The strategies that had sustained him for decades were now countered by relentless observation, advanced technology, and international coordination. Confinement demanded new approaches, observation became defensive, planning became abstract, and influence had to be exerted through indirect means. Adaptation, once external, now had to be internalized. The capture also underscored the limitations of even the most meticulous planning. Years of discipline, patient observation, and strategic foresight had delayed the inevitable, but the combination of persistent surveillance, layered intelligence, and technological tools eventually closed the gap. Joaquin's experience demonstrated that longevity in evasion relies on both skill and the absence of cumulative, coordinated opposition. When the opposition matures, persistence alone cannot suffice. As he was relocated to secure facilities following the arrest, the environment reinforced these lessons. Security protocols were rigorous, surveillance constant, and movement controlled. Every aspect of daily life was monitored, reducing opportunities for improvisation or concealment. Yet the skills cultivated over decades, patience, observation, and strategic thinking, remained valuable, now repurposed for understanding and navigating this new reality. The arrest in Los Mochis was not an explosive spectacle but a culmination of relentless, patient, and coordinated pressure. It marked the transition from decades of mobility and adaptation to a phase defined by containment, observation, and endurance. For Joaquin, this represented both an ending and a continuation, an ending of freedom, but a continuation of vigilance, strategy, and adaptation within a new framework. The consequences of this final apprehension extended beyond the immediate moment, influencing law enforcement strategy, organizational resilience, and the perception of one of the most enigmatic figures in organized crime history. The transfer from Mexico to the United States marked the beginning of a new chapter for Joaquin, one defined not by mobility or evasion, but by exposure and scrutiny. Extradition had long been a looming possibility, and its reality imposed a framework entirely different from the environments he had previously navigated. Walls, bars, and guards were now supplemented by legal systems, surveillance, and procedural oversight that left no room for improvisation. In this setting, his skills in patience, observation, and strategic thinking were tested in entirely new ways. Upon arrival in the United States, Joaquin faced the full weight of the federal legal apparatus. He was no longer simply a target to be evaded, he became a defendant in a system designed to dismantle not only his freedom, but the infrastructure he had built over decades. The legal process, with its meticulous attention to documentation, evidence, and testimony, created constraints as precise and unforgiving as any physical barrier he had encountered. Each motion, each hearing, and each procedural step had implications far beyond the courtroom itself. The trial proceedings were extensive, drawing international attention. Witnesses recounted the inner workings of the organization he had led, detailing operations, financial channels, and strategies. The testimonies were not theatrical embellishments, but factual accounts supported by documentation, surveillance records, and corroborating evidence. For Joaquin, the experience was a stark reminder that even the most carefully guarded secrets can be exposed when the right combination of persistence, intelligence, and authority is applied. Financial evidence played a central role. Money laundering schemes, shell companies, and international transactions were meticulously reconstructed to demonstrate the scale and sophistication of the enterprise. For decades, he had relied on complexity and compartmentalization to obscure operations, but in the courtroom, this very complexity became tangible, traceable, and incriminating. The networks he had built to protect and empower the organization now served as evidence against him. Testimony from former associates underscored the human dimension of accountability. Individuals who had once been loyal or complicit provided detailed accounts of decisions, actions, and responsibilities. The legal system leveraged their insight not to embellish, but to construct a coherent, verifiable narrative. Joaquin observed this with a mix of professional detachment and strategic calculation, noting how authority could transform human behavior in ways that surveillance or enforcement alone could not achieve. The trial itself was exhaustive. Courtrooms, judges, prosecutors, and defense attorneys became the terrain upon which strategy had to be applied differently. Whereas freedom had demanded movement and concealment, the courtroom demanded presence, composure, and precise engagement. Every statement, every reaction, and every decision carried weight beyond immediate consequence. The mental rigor required to navigate these proceedings was as demanding as any physical escape or operational maneuver. Conviction was ultimately inevitable. The weight of evidence, coupled with the persistent pursuit by authorities, left no viable path to acquittal. Joaquin was sentenced to life imprisonment, an outcome that reflected both the severity of the crimes and the effectiveness of the coordinated international effort to dismantle the enterprise. For someone who had spent decades shaping a system resilient to capture, the sentence represented a shift from managing mobility to enduring permanence. Life within the high-security U.S. prison system introduced a new environment of constraint. Unlike previous confinement, the systems in place were designed to minimize opportunity, maximize observation, and enforce strict routines. Surveillance was constant, physical space restricted, and communication tightly monitored. Every action, from movement to correspondence, was subject to oversight. In this setting, the tactics that had once protected him, patience, discretion, compartmentalization, remained relevant, but their application had changed. Psychologically, the transition from freedom to life imprisonment required adaptation. The ability to observe, anticipate, and influence now manifested primarily through indirect means. Correspondence, visitation, and limited access to trusted intermediaries became critical channels for maintaining influence or understanding the outside environment. Adaptation demanded acceptance of permanent limitation while maintaining cognitive engagement. For the organization he had once led, Joaquin's removal represented both disruption and continuity. Decentralization, established over decades, allowed operations to persist despite the absence of its central figure. Regional leadership assumed responsibility, routes were adjusted, and operational protocols continued largely intact. The structural foresight embedded in the network ensured resilience, demonstrating that systems, once carefully designed, can endure beyond the presence of any single individual. The broader implications of the trial extended beyond personal accountability. Law enforcement agencies and international partners leveraged the case as a model of coordinated action. Techniques in intelligence gathering, financial tracking, and witness management were tested and refined. Joaquin's prosecution became a case study in the limits of operational secrecy when confronted with persistent, multi-layered investigation. Media coverage amplified the perception of finality. Stories emphasized the life sentence, the dismantling of networks, and the symbolic closure of a chapter in organized crime history. Public perception framed Joaquin as a figure of both infamy and legend, reinforcing narratives that had persisted for decades. Yet behind this symbolic closure remained practical realities. Networks continued, influence persisted, and the lessons from his operations continued to resonate within enforcement and criminal circles alike. Within the confines of life imprisonment, routine became both structure and necessity. Observation, previously applied externally, now focused internally, monitoring staff routines, institutional procedures, and potential opportunities for influence or communication. Adaptation, the skill that had defined his life, remained central. Control shifted from external maneuvering to internal awareness, and success was measured in endurance and insight rather than mobility. Ultimately, this phase represented the culmination of decades-long engagement with systems, movement, and human behavior. Freedom, movement, and evasion had given way to observation, patience, and endurance within confinement. Joaquin's experience underscores a consistent theme: power and influence are contingent on adaptability. In the U.S. prison system, his survival relied less on mobility and more on strategic cognitive engagement, emphasizing that control is as much a matter of perception and understanding as it is of action. The transition from fugitive to life prisoner exemplifies the shift from operational autonomy to enforced stability. Whereas the outside world demanded improvisation, stealth, and negotiation, the inside world demanded observation, compliance, and adaptation to rigid structures. Joaquin's capacity to navigate these contrasting environments demonstrates a continuity of strategic thinking, highlighting that the principles guiding influence and resilience remain consistent even as contexts change dramatically. The life sentence, while limiting physical freedom, did not erase the intellectual discipline, foresight, and strategic awareness that had defined his existence for decades. History does not remember the quiet moments as readily as the dramatic ones, yet it is in those moments that the true impact of a life is measured. Joaquin Guzman's story, from the mountains of Sinaloa to the high-security cells of the United States, is one of contrasts: invisibility and notoriety, patience and audacity, survival and inevitability. His life's trajectory reveals not only the mechanics of power within the underworld but also the broader consequences of an empire built on both human ingenuity and systemic exploitation. From his earliest years, Joaquin was shaped by scarcity, isolation, and the unforgiving terrain of northern Mexico. The mountains that nurtured him offered both protection and challenge. Trails and valleys became classrooms in observation, caution, and adaptability. The rhythms of rural life, the demands of family survival, and the constant presence of risk instilled in him a patience and a strategic mindset that would guide him throughout his life. What began as necessity evolved into a set of skills that allowed him to navigate complexity with precision and calm. As he matured, Joaquin's talents were applied to the cultivation and movement of controlled substances, first within local networks and later within the Guadalajara cartel. This environment provided both opportunity and education. He learned how to manage people, resources, and logistics, how to balance risk and reward, and how to exploit both human behavior and systemic gaps to maintain advantage. It was during these years that he understood the power of discretion, the importance of reliability, and the strategic value of invisibility. The collapse of the Guadalajara cartel, precipitated in part by the assassination of DEA agent Enrique Camarena, tested his capacity to adapt. While others were caught in chaos, Joaquin applied the lessons of patience and observation to navigate the vacuum left by the disintegration of authority. The formation of the Sinaloa cartel demonstrated his ability not only to survive but to restructure power in a way that emphasized flexibility, decentralization, and sustainability. Here, he combined his understanding of geography, logistics, and human networks into an enterprise that would endure despite constant external pressure. One of the defining aspects of Joaquin's approach was his mastery of movement. Land routes, air transport, maritime logistics, and underground tunnels became the veins through which his organization operated. Each route, each method, was meticulously planned, tested, and executed to minimize exposure and maximize efficiency. The sophistication of this system allowed him to operate on a scale previously unseen in organized crime, moving enormous quantities of product across borders with remarkable reliability. Yet even in these operations, the underlying principle remained consistent: control through preparation, patience, and observation, rather than spectacle. Paradoxically, his most potent power derived from his invisibility. Unlike contemporaries who sought notoriety through displays of wealth or violence, Joaquin cultivated discretion. He avoided public attention, delegated operational responsibilities, and maintained a personal lifestyle that minimized vulnerability. This restraint was strategic, reducing the likelihood of both legal scrutiny and betrayal within his organization. It also reinforced the myth surrounding him, a figure whose reputation often outpaced the facts, whose presence was felt more than seen, and whose actions, when finally observed, seemed almost inevitable in their precision. Yet the world was changing. Increased international cooperation, advanced surveillance technologies, and the relentless patience of law enforcement slowly eroded the safety his discretion had provided. The first capture in 1993, while initially a setback, became a lesson in the adaptability of confinement and the exploitation of system vulnerabilities. The escape from Puente Grande in 2001, executed through a meticulously constructed tunnel, reinforced his mastery of patience, planning, and exploitation of human error. These events became legendary, emblematic of both his ingenuity and the limits of institutional control. The subsequent expansion of the Sinaloa cartel into a global enterprise demonstrated his capacity to scale knowledge from local to transnational contexts. Supply chains extended to Europe, Asia, and beyond, financial operations became increasingly complex, and the network of human and logistical resources reflected a sophisticated understanding of both opportunity and risk. The integration of technology, while cautiously applied, allowed coordination across continents, enabling the organization to function efficiently despite constant threat. Yet this expansion also brought increased attention. Media coverage, international rankings, and public fascination transformed his life into a spectacle, demonstrating the double-edged nature of success. Visibility can be as dangerous as invisibility is protective. Rivalries, particularly with the Tijuana and Juarez cartels, highlighted the persistent tension between consolidation and competition in organized crime. Joaquin's approach, strategic patience, selective violence, and careful negotiation, allowed him to navigate these conflicts with minimal disruption to his operations. He understood that dominance was not about aggression alone, but about managing perception, maintaining loyalty, and exploiting structural weaknesses in rival systems. Cities like Ciudad Juarez became arenas of subtle contestation, where control was exercised not only through force but through logistics, timing, and intelligence. His later captures, first in 2014 in Mazatlan and then finally in 2016 in Los Mochis, underscored both the persistence of law enforcement and the limits of individual ingenuity. In each case, Joaquin's freedom was curtailed not through dramatic confrontation but through patient, coordinated, and methodical application of intelligence, surveillance, and procedural control. The arrests reflected an evolution in pursuit strategies, long-term observation, pattern analysis, and coordinated international action proved more effective than hasty or visible attempts at intervention. For Joaquin, these captures marked not the end of his influence but the transition of that influence into new forms, strategic thought, network guidance, and legacy management within confinement. Extradition to the United States and the subsequent trial introduced a different set of constraints. Here, mobility was irrelevant, influence became abstract, exercised through legal channels, counsel, and observation of procedural behavior. Evidence presented in court documented decades of operational complexity, financial maneuvering, and organizational structure. Witness testimony, corroborated by documentation and surveillance, rendered the once invisible mechanics of his empire tangible. The trial illustrated that power, no matter how well concealed, is always vulnerable to systematic, persistent, and coordinated scrutiny. A life sentence followed, cementing the reality that Joaquin's era of physical mobility had ended. Yet even within the high-security confines of a U.S. prison, his life remained defined by the principles that had guided him for decades: observation, adaptation, and strategic patience. The environment demanded new methods of influence and awareness. The physical world of escape, tunnels, and safe houses was replaced by the cognitive world of monitoring routines, understanding personnel, and maintaining indirect control over remaining networks. Beyond his personal narrative, Joaquin's life had far-reaching consequences. Communities in Sinaloa and other regions experienced both the tangible and intangible effects of his empire. Economic systems, informal power structures, and social dynamics were reshaped, for better or worse, by the presence of organized networks that balanced coercion with calculated support. Law enforcement agencies evolved in response, refining methods of intelligence, coordination, and prosecution. The global drug trade adapted, learning both from his innovations and from his eventual containment. The myth of El Chapo, in particular, reflects the interplay between perception and reality. To some, he became a symbol of audacity and cunning, to others, a figure of destruction and corruption. Media portrayals often exaggerated certain elements while simplifying others, contributing to a narrative that oscillated between legend and infamy. Yet within these narratives lies a consistent truth. Joaquin's life demonstrates the power of strategy, adaptation, and patient observation in navigating complex systems, whether natural, human, or institutional. Reflecting on his journey, the contrast between origin and outcome is striking. A boy from a remote, impoverished village in Sinaloa, exposed to hardship, labor, and isolation, evolved into a figure whose decisions influenced global markets, altered law enforcement strategies, and reshaped criminal dynamics across continents. The trajectory illustrates how environment, opportunity, and human agency intersect to produce outcomes that reverberate far beyond the immediate actors involved. Even in confinement, the lessons of Joaquin's life endure. Systems matter more than individuals. Redundancy and decentralization provide resilience. Patience and observation often outweigh aggression. Complexity, when managed carefully, can create both protection and influence. Yet these same systems are never infallible. Vigilance, adaptability, and the recognition of inevitable change remain essential. Ultimately, Joaquin Guzman's story is not merely a chronicle of crime, evasion, or notoriety. It is a study in human adaptability, strategic thinking, and the interplay between individual agency and structural forces. The mountains of Sinaloa, the tunnels of Puente Grande, the global logistics networks, and the courtroom in New York all represent stages upon which principles of observation, planning, and calculated patience were tested and applied. His life exemplifies both the possibilities and limitations of power when it is exercised with discretion, ingenuity, and relentless attention to detail. As history reflects on Joaquin Guzman, the legacy is multifaceted. It is the story of audacity and innovation, but also of consequence, accountability, and systemic impact. Communities, institutions, and markets were shaped by his actions. Law enforcement and international cooperation evolved in response. Myths, legends, and media narratives continue to circulate, blending fact with interpretation, yet beneath them lies the unvarnished truth, a life defined by observation, adaptation, and the relentless pursuit of control within a world that constantly shifted around him. In the stillness of high-security confinement, removed from the landscapes that once defined him, Joaquin remains a testament to the enduring principles that guided him: patience, strategic thinking, and the ability to navigate complex systems. The mountains, the tunnels, the logistics, and the networks, once tools of freedom and survival, now exist as markers of a life that shaped both human behavior and institutional response. History remembers not only the audacity of the man but also the systems he created, the lessons they impart, and the echoes of a shadow that stretched across continents, time, and imagination. The story of Joaquin Guzman concludes not with spectacle, but with reflection, a quiet testament to the interplay of environment, strategy, and consequence, leaving an indelible imprint on the world that bore witness to it.